The first order of business is to showcase a larger gavel, more commensurate with the Lone Star State and the expectation of my citizens in Texas. Welcome. Good morning. Thank you to my colleagues for your time and your commitment, and especially thank you to our witnesses. My script here. Hearing will come to order. I yield myself such time as I may consume for an opening statement. This committee is charged with the fiduciary responsibility of resourcing the people's government and the fiscal trajectory of the United States of America. And right now, by any measure, we are well off track. We have convened this hearing today to sound the alarm for the American people and create a sense of urgency among our nation's leaders. The nation's fiscal outlook is rapidly deteriorating following a 2-year avalanche of new spending that added more than $6 trillion to our national debt and triggered painful historic levels of inflation on working families across the country. Our unprecedented, almost incomprehensible $31 trillion of national debt has eclipsed the size of our economy, the largest in the world. Over the next decade, according to the nonpartisan CBO, our annual deficits will double, our interest payments will triple, and for every dollar we borrow, 50 cents will go just to paying the interest on our debt. In just 5 years, interest payments alone will exceed what we spend on our entire national defense. The only other time in American history that our debt to GDP ratio has been this high was in the aftermath of World War II. We were able to recover from that because we had the will to reduce our spending and the runway to grow our economy back to a healthy balance sheet. Today, we're looking at a very different picture. Reckless spending and record inflation have left a trail of economic destruction for working families and small businesses in the form of shrinking paychecks, soaring interest rates, labor shortages, and a whole generation of Americans trapped in a cycle of poverty and government dependency. What makes this all the more disturbing is that we were warned. For the last 3 decades, we have known the structural challenges we face, from the largest generational retirement in the world to the rise in automatic spending consuming more of our revenues, and now runaway interest on the debt. And for the last 2 years, this administration, I believe, has just thrown gasoline on that fire with its unbridled spending. And the proposed budget of the president would do more of the same, if not double down. If we don't change course and change soon, sustained stagnation could very quickly give way to a debt crisis that threatens not only our economy, but our national security, with dwindling resources and dire choices putting our republic and our children's future at risk. Folks, it's well past time to think about the unthinkable, but it doesn't have to be this way. We can change it. Together we can change it. The fiscal state of our nation is certainly unsustainable, but not unfixable. That window, I believe, is closing. The president had the opportunity to set a new course and provide real leadership earlier this month with his budget proposal. Instead, his vision calls for the highest levels of sustained taxes, spending, and borrowing in the history of our country, even by Washington standard. It is a budget binge of catastrophic proportions. In fact, even after trillions of dollars in new tax hikes on families, job creators, and energy producers, that still isn't nearly enough to make up for the vast and radical expansion of government that the president seeks. All 10 years of the spending proposed in the president's budget are at a quarter of our entire economy. All 10 years, a level that we haven't seen since the invasion of Normandy. And with his failed tax and spending policies constraining growth, our debt to GDP ratio will continue to deteriorate, hitting an unconscionable almost incalculable level of 220% or more by 2053. At the State of the Union, the President kept saying, finish the job. But I believe his plan doesn't even start the job of addressing the real challenges. And in my opinion, the greatest challenge of the 21st century, the prospect of a debt crisis. And his vision, in my opinion, is too radical, too reckless, and too disconnected to meet this moment. But we have to, members of this committee, Republican and Democrat, we must reverse course by stopping the spending spree, unlocking economic growth, and fixing our nation's finances before it's too late. As we look to lift our country out of this mess, several key principles emerge that must be included in any responsible plan, and these will certainly be the guiding principles for the budget that we will propose and open up for criticism and contrast and oversight. Number one, we must rein in wasteful, woke, and bloated bureaucracy and the out-of-control spending that created it. Number two, we must reduce unnecessary government burden and reestablish pro-growth policies that create jobs and promote prosperity for all Americans. We must end the era of dependency for able-bodied adults, encourage labor force participation, and restore the dignity of work in this country. We must stop the assault on U.S. energy production and unleash American energy dominance once again. And we must absolutely prioritize the first and most important job of the federal government, and that's the safety and security of the American people. With uncommon courage and common sense economic policies, we can stave off a debt crisis. We can strengthen America's balance sheet, and we can save the Union. That's our calling. That's our mission. May have different views on how to do that, but I hope that we can at least agree that this current path is completely unsustainable, and we can't continue down it for the love of country and our children's future. The longer we wait to start this work, the more drastic our choices will be. The more likely it becomes that future generations will be trapped in a broken economy with a bleak outlook at best. If we don't have a sense of urgency about the task before us, as I said, our children will not inherit the blessings of liberty and opportunity. Instead, they'll reap the whirlwind of an irreparable economic disaster in some form and at some point. Scary thing is, most people don't know when, but when it happens, it's hard to put it back. We've sounded the alarm, my friend and ranking member, and now we must answer the call to act. I now recognize my friend and colleague, the ranking member from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. And I'd also like to welcome our witnesses and really appreciate you taking the time to be here. The first thing that must be said when considering the fiscal state of the Union is that we are having this discussion from a place of economic stability and strength that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. And I know I began our last hearing by reciting this, and I'll do so again because it is worth remembering. In March of 2021, exactly 2 years ago, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office was projecting that unemployment would remain above 4% for the rest of the decade. But after the passage of the American Rescue Plan, that picture changed dramatically. Unemployment fell rapidly, and the speed and size of our economic recovery has made America the envy of the world. Experts at Moody's Analytics found that the American Rescue Plan helped create 4 million additional jobs and doubled GDP growth in 2021. Today, American workers have benefited from a record 12.4 million jobs created since President Biden took office. So there is no doubt the American Rescue Plan dramatically changed our fiscal state for the better. But it was a response to a once-in-a-generation pandemic and the associated economic crisis, not a permanent fix to address underlying issues impacting our society and our economic outlook. Which brings me to my next point. We agree, our nation does face long-term fiscal challenges. Our population, like most in the Western world, is aging. So healthcare, Social Security, and Medicare costs are rising. Rising inequality is making our country more vulnerable to recessions and other economic shocks, hampering growth. Climate disruptions are becoming more frequent and more expensive. And we lag peer nations in investments in children, especially in the early years of their lives, where you get the best bang for your buck. And yes, deficits and debt are projected, especially in the next decade, to reach levels that simply none of us would be comfortable with. So we're seeing a similar picture, and we do have very different ideas as to where the solutions lie. Democrats have used our fiscal space to make responsible, pro-growth investments that strengthen our communities and our economy while paying down the deficit. That's why Democrats followed up on the success of the Rescue Plan with historic legislation to set our nation and people up for long-term success, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, FY 22 and 23 appropriations bills, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, I do want to address where I think there is some disagreement. Republicans believe we can cut our way to a balanced budget. That's not only false, it's dangerous. Analysis from the nonpartisan CBO proves this. An attempt to balance the budget without touching Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, veterans mandatory spending, and without increased revenues would require eliminating every program, every service, and every investment Americans count on. In the end, it still wouldn't balance the budget, but it would gut government to the point society would no longer be able to function. These types of proposals have devastating consequences. Dr. Zandi and Moody Analytics released a projection a few weeks ago that showed these policies would cause a recession in 2024, eliminate 2.5 million jobs, and push unemployment to about 6%. We can't escape the bottom line. To tackle our long-term fiscal challenges, we need to rebalance our tax code and prioritize investments with a high rate of return. For there is no better investment than investing in the American people. And with that, and just under the 5 minutes, I want to thank our witnesses for being here. I look forward to their testimony, and I yield back the remaining 14 seconds. Efficient. See?
I note your efficiency, my friend, and I appreciate that because we have a panel of experts here today, and I know they have tremendous insight to share with us, all of them across the board here. So the Honorable David Walker has joined us, and he is the 7th Comptroller General of the United States from 1998 to 2008. Thank you, sir, for your service. Also joining us today on the panel, the Honorable John Taylor, Professor of Economics at Stanford University and former Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs from 2001 to 2005. We also have Mr. Scott Hodge, President Emeritus and Senior Policy Advisor at the Tax Foundation, and then Dr. Mark Zandi, Chief Economist of Moody's Analytics, and we are honored by your presence, and we appreciate your insight. So we've received your written statements as a committee. They'll be made part of the formal hearing record, and now you will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Mr. Walker, we will begin with you, and I yield the 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Boyle, members of the House Budget Committee. Appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm a political independent who's been fighting for fiscal responsibility and sustainability for 30 years, beginning when I was one of 2 public trustees for Social Security and Medicare, and we blew the whistle to say that those programs were not sustainable in their present form. When I became Comptroller General of the United States and head of the GAO in 1998, debt to GDP was about 60%, and we were in surplus. When I left, as head of the GAO in 2008, debt to GDP was a little over 60% before the banking crisis, but I could tell that we were in terrible shape and things were going to get a lot worse. Unfortunately, since I left GAO, the debt subject to the debt ceiling has tripled, debt to GDP has doubled, and both metrics are still increasing at a rapid rate. The latest CBO budget and fiscal report in February 2023 included the following direct quote: "The fiscal outlook is far worse than last year due to legislation, executive actions, and economic changes. The latest consolidated and accrual-based financial statements and GAO audit report for the fiscal year ended 2022 made it clear that 2022 was a very bad year. Total liabilities and unfunded promises went up by almost $9 trillion to over $900,000 per household." In addition, we look at, during the past 2 years, the Congress, 2+ years, the Congress has engaged in trillions of dollars of additional federal spending, much of which related to COVID, some of which because of belief in the flawed and failed modern monetary theory. The Fed, intentionally or unintentionally, enabled such actions by keeping interest rates too low for too long and bought trillions of dollars of Treasury securities directly. The resulting significant increase in interest rates resulting from the Fed's effort to combat inflation during the past year contributed to the recent bank failures and current uncertainty in our banking system. Looking forward, the latest CBO long-range budget projection of February 2023 estimated the debt to GDP will climb to 193% by 2050. That's an 8% increase above the projection last year. You know, there's a tendency to focus on numbers when talking about budget proposals, but it's important to remember that the budget is not just about numbers. It's a proposed policy path. From a strategic standpoint, the plain and simple and hard truth is the United States is a declining great power, and China is rising. The facts are clear and compelling. It is true that the U.S. is the leading global superpower today, but the real question is, will we remain so in the future? One of the biggest differences between China and the U.S. is that China has a comprehensive, integrated, outcome-based strategic plan to achieve its economic, diplomatic, military, and cultural objectives, and the United States does not. The federal budget is a short-term policy proposal. It's not a long-term plan, and it's not outcome-oriented. Today, America is flying blind in mountains of debt and without a navigation system. This is unacceptable and must change if we want our future to be better than our past. President Biden proposed his fiscal 2024 budget on March 9. It proposes a 57% increase from the pre-pandemic level in fiscal 2019 and results in annual deficits in excess of 5% of GDP over the next 10 years, despite $3 trillion in tax increases during the same period. While it does propose some Medicare funding-related reforms that will extend the solvency life of the HI Trust Fund, it does not deal with the other Medicare programs and does not touch Social Security. As a result, it continues to kick the can down the road in making the tough choices that are necessary to restore sanity. I've suggested a three-pronged approach to be able to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability outlined in my testimony. First, stop the bleeding. We need to cut 2024 spending as compared to 2023. I outlined a number of ideas how to do that. Secondly, we must stabilize the patient. We have to have a mechanism that will help us to make the tough choices to close the gap between projected spending and projected revenue over the next 10 to 15 years. That will require educating and engaging the American people in a very meaningful way. I outline the reasons why in my testimony, and I suggest that we need a statutory fiscal sustainability commission that will engage the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, come back with recommendations, guaranteed vote in Congress. That's what we need to do. Simpson-Bowles was not focused that way. That should be an appropriate condition to raising the debt ceiling. We have to cure the disease. In that regard, statutory approaches have failed. The debt ceiling is a bad joke. We need a constitutional amendment that limits debt as a percentage of the economy, and I commend Chairman Arrington for introducing HCR 24, and I would ask all of you to look at HCR 24 and potentially co-sponsor it. You have a constitutional duty under Article 5, and this Convention of States to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment should have been called in 1979, and I outline all the differences. And the dollar has gone down over 75% since then, and the debt has exploded from less than $1 trillion to $32 trillion. In closing, we need to learn from history, and we need to learn from others. I'll give you one piece of history. Rome lasted over 1,000 years. It was a superpower in its time. Rome no longer exists. It went out for several reasons: fiscal responsibility, political incivility, moral decline, overextended military, and inability to control its borders. Do those sound familiar? It's time to wake up, create mechanisms to make tough choices so that our future can be better than our past. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Comptroller General. Now yielding 5 minutes to Dr. Taylor. Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Member Boyle, all members of the committee for inviting me to speak here today. It's a very important topic, the fiscal state of the union. I'll begin by referring to some data recently submitted as part of the budget of the United States fiscal year 2004. Table 1 of my written testimony shows the growth rate of real GDP from 2021 to 2031. The average is only about 2% per year. I think it's due to policy. We could do better than this. We need to do better than this. Much is related to fiscal policy. It's not a good program. Table 2 of my written testimony shows the federal budget as a percent of GDP going out the same number of years. Receipts, outlays, and the deficit all remain very high. The fiscal state of the union is not good. Efforts are needed to reduce these budget deficits. At previous hearings, including 2015 hearing of this committee, which is entitled Why Congress Must Balance the Budget, I showed, using economic theory and empirical models, that imply high federal government deficits and debt have a cost. They reduce real income per household. A recent examination shows the same results. In previous testimony, I also recommended a fiscal policy based on established economic principles. That policy should be permanent, should be pervasive, and should be predictable. This is not the kind of economic policy that has been proposed going forward. Rather than being predictable, the policy response has created uncertainty about the debts, growing federal spending, future tax rate increases, new regulations, even how we will exit from the rules-based monetary policy. Rather than permanent, it is temporary and thereby not creating a lasting economic recovery. Rather than being pervasive, it targets certain sectors or groups. It's not surprising, therefore, that the policy has left us with lower growth going forward. Going forward, I think we need a renewed set of principles. Based on experience as well as economic theory, I recommend this alternative, a stimulus mantra: permanent, pervasive, and predictable. It's so important to get this right, and those are the three characteristics that I elaborate in my written testimony. Let me conclude, if I may, with a word about monetary policy, which is closely related, closely linked to fiscal policy, as well as to regulatory policy, as well as international economic policy. I am very pleased that the Fed has again included in its monetary policy report rules such as the Taylor Rule, named after me, in this monetary policy report. It is good that rules are back. I think it's terrific, but the Fed got behind, as we have already heard, in formally incorporating rules or procedures into its actual decisions. Thus, inflation has risen. It's not the only reason, but it's a big reason. We are still living in a high inflation era unless monetary policy actions continue to be taken. If we use the so-called Taylor Rule, plug in an inflation rate of 4%, which is where we are, a target inflation rate of 2%, where we want to be, an equilibrium interest rate of 1% is what the current estimate is, and the gap between real GDP's potential is 0, then you still get a federal funds rate higher than it is now, maybe as high as 6%. There are now reasons greater than ever for the Fed to use a more rules-based policy. The policy interest rate should increase as inflation rises, as has now begun to happen big time. It would, of course, be a contingency plan, as are all rules or procedures, including fiscal rules and procedures. This would greatly reduce the chances of large, damaging changes later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Scott Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Boyle, members of the committee. Last week, I was in Kyiv, Ukraine. I was a guest speaker at the Ukrainian Tax Reform and Anti-Corruption Summit, sponsored by the government. The goal of the summit was to provide Ukrainian leaders with best practices on how to reform their tax system, strengthen their economy, and get their fiscal house in order. They did not want theories. They wanted concrete examples of countries that have successfully reformed their tax code and kept the government finances in check. I presented them with a number of examples. The U.S. was not one of them. The U.S. may be a symbol of many things to people around the globe, but it is not a model of fiscal discipline or restraint. Our national debt at roughly 100% of GDP is the highest we've had since we were at war nearly 80 years ago. Our nearly $1.4 trillion deficit last year was equal to the GDP of Spain, and it is higher than the GDPs of 180 other countries. Many of these budget problems are being driven by entitlement programs that are already bankrupt on a cash basis and must rely on a massive infusion of general revenues to keep them afloat. The federal budget is more of a museum of American history than the Smithsonian. Name an era in American history and there is an obsolete program or agency from past eras still being funded today. The budget is full of redundant programs that need to be streamlined. The General Accounting Office, or GAO, has identified hundreds of federal programs that duplicate each other's missions and could be streamlined. The federal budget is still running failing business enterprises such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, Amtrak, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the U.S. Postal Service. These and many more federal assets should be sold off and the proceeds used to pay down the national debt. We have an analog government in a digital world. It's more than ironic that while Congress prides itself for having passed the CHIPS Act, most federal agencies are decades behind the technological curve. The IRS and the air traffic control system are two of the most glaring examples. Waste, fraud, and abuse really does add up to real money. The federal CFO website estimates that federal agencies paid out roughly $250 billion worth of improper payments last year. Half of that came from Medicare. For a nation that prides itself on being a beacon for free enterprise, both the tax code and the federal budget are chock full of corporate welfare. The Inflation Reduction Act is perhaps one of the worst examples of corporate welfare ever enacted by this body. President Biden's budget plan makes the government's fiscal crisis worse. Not only would the budget plan increase the national debt from 100% of GDP to 110% of GDP, it's also bad for the economy. The Tax Foundation's macroeconomic tax model estimates that the President Biden's tax plan would reduce the long-term size of the economy by 1.3%, reduce the capital stock, reduce wages, and eliminate 335,000 jobs. Mr. Chairman, Congress must take systemic and deliberate steps toward fiscal balance. You should put yourselves in the mindset of being consultants overseeing an enterprise that's been put in receivership. You must make hard choices, terminate obsolete and redundant programs, sell off state-owned enterprises, eliminate corporate welfare. If a company or industry cannot survive without taxpayer assistance, it should not be allowed to survive. Finally, you can no longer put off fixing our major entitlement programs. These programs are bankrupt now and are getting worse. No member of this body is in a position to criticize the management of Silicon Valley Bank for failing to foresee the crisis in their balance sheet when the financial crises in Social Security and Medicare have been known and getting worse for years. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the fiscal state of the union is frankly embarrassing. Federal spending, deficits, and debt are at unsustainable levels. The budget is laden with redundant, obsolete programs, corporate welfare, nationalized industries. Moreover, Social Security and Medicare are bankrupt now. The Biden budget would just make all of these problems worse. America's ability to be a global moral authority is undermined by our lack of fiscal discipline and restraint. If the Ukrainians can stand up to corruption and the Russians, certainly this body can muster the courage to provide fiscal leadership and responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
I thank the gentleman, Mr. Hodge, and yield 5 minutes to Dr. Zandi.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and the rest of the committee for the opportunity to be here today. I should say I'm the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, but my views that I express here are my own views, not Moody's. I'll make 3 points in my remarks. Point number one, fiscal policies legislated since the pandemic hit 3 years ago have, in my view, in their totality, been successful. The pandemic rescue packages, beginning with the CARES Act that was passed 3 years ago, March of 2020, through the American Rescue Plan passed in March of 2021, have gone a long way to restoring the economy to full employment. You can see that clearly in the labor market, the job market. Congressman Boyle pointed out all the job growth. Unemployment's back to 3.6% nationwide. That's consistent with a full employment economy. That would not have happened without the very aggressive, muscular response and the rapidity at which you responded to the crisis, very laudable. I think it's fair to say that the economy still is struggling with the fallout from the pandemic, and of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine has complicated things as well. Inflation is high, painfully high, interest rates are high, the economy is vulnerable. But I don't think you can lay these problems at the feet of the policy response to the crisis. The other thing I'd say about the policy response is without it, the economy would have been significantly diminished and our fiscal problems meaningfully more severe. The hit to revenues, the demands through automatic stabilizers on our spending would have resulted in bigger budget deficits and a higher debt load than exists today. I also would like to point out that the legislation since the American Rescue Plan, which includes the infrastructure legislation, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, I do think will be very important to the nation's long-term economic growth. I think these are things that we needed to do, and I think they will add to the economy's long-term growth prospects and help from a geopolitical perspective in terms of supply chains and the chip industry. So I think those are very important pieces of legislation that will be very positive to the economy as we move forward. Second point I'd like to make is that lawmakers have an immediate challenge, and that is raising the debt limit. That has to happen. Very uncertain when the Treasury is going to run out of cash to pay all the government's bills on time, but by our calculation, that's going to happen sometime in mid-August. And so I suspect when we come back after July 4th, this is going to come to the fore in financial markets very significantly. And as we approach that so-called X date in mid-August, pressures in the financial system are going to build. And as we can see from recent events, given the banking crisis, the system is very fragile at this point in time. And adding the debt limit as an issue for investors would be particularly inopportune at this point in time. So this has to be addressed, and I don't think there's any possibility it can be addressed through prioritization. We can talk about that, but a lot of work has been done in this area. Technically, debt can be prioritized, but I don't think investors are going to be convinced that they're going to get paid before Social Security recipients, the military, or even the federal government's electric bill for very long. So it's not going to forestall a crisis. And finally, point number three, I very much agree, there are very significant long-term fiscal challenges. I mean, just take a look at the CBO's, February 23 economic and budget outlook. And the economic assumptions are very reasonable. The budget outlook is unsustainable. The headline number, debt to GDP, 97% today. It's going to be 118% under current law 10 years from now. I think a good rule of thumb is every percentage point increase in the debt to GDP ratio ultimately adds 2 basis points to the 10-year Treasury yield. So if you just do just a little bit of arithmetic, interest rates are going to be 40, 50 basis points higher 10 years from now, all else being equal because of our fiscal situation. And obviously, the world doesn't end 10 years from now. The budget outlook looks even worse, after that. So we do need to address that, and I do think it does require both tax increases and government spending restraint to be able to do that going forward. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate the witnesses. Let's move now to the Q&A session, and we yield 5 minutes to myself to begin. I didn't plan on asking this, but as I listened to you, Mr. Walker, before I arrived in this new role, I admired you from afar as I don't know if you were on a bus or you were in a Volkswagen or what you were, how your mode of transportation, but you crisscrossed the United States and you were sounding the alarm. And here's what, and I don't think we've ever talked about this. What was the response from the American people? Have they just gotten so numb to the debt clock ticking away with no major significant or serious consequences? I'd like to get to a place where we can agree on the facts. I heard a lot of this about the unsustainability. I'd love to get to a place, Ranking Member Boyle, where all of us could agree on the numbers, the facts, the path. We may disagree on how to address it, but where we can all take that to the American people and say, you know what? It's a problem. It's not Republican problem or Democrat problem. It's a mathematic reality, and it is a problem for this great country. So what was the response, Mr. Walker?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've done public education engagement events in 47 states plus D.C. During my career, and I've done them in 25 states just in the last 15 months. The most significant one was the 10 million a minute tour. That's how much our total liabilities and unfunded promises were going up a minute in 2012. I went to 27 states, 10,000 miles. It was funded largely by H. Ross Perot Sr., may he rest in peace. What I found in partnership with Alice Rivlin and others, and may she rest in peace, is the American people are a lot smarter than many people here realize. They know you can't spend more money than you make, charge to the credit card, without having a day of reckoning. They are willing to accept tough choices if they are part of a comprehensive plan designed to meet a specific objective, consistent with principles and values that bring people together rather than divide them apart. And in fact, we were able to achieve over 90% agreement from representative groups of voters, statistically representative groups of voters in the North and the South on a goal, a debt-to-GDP goal, a ratio of spending to revenues, and specific tax, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare, defense, government organization operations, and political reforms. Minimum 77%, over 90%. Simpson-Bowles did not do that. What has to be done is a statutory commission that engages the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, helps them understand that we have to make tough choices sooner rather than later, help them get input from them, seriously consider it, and then set the table for a tough vote by Congress. So they're way ahead. And by the way, I brought something. This is one of the original charts used by H. Ross Perot in 1992.
Wow.
The slope is not correct. The endpoint is. He predicted that the debt would be $8.5 trillion at the end of 2006. What was it? $8.5 trillion. What is it now? Almost $32 trillion. And as I mentioned before, that doesn't count unfunded civilian and military pensions, retiree health care, Social Security, Medicare. The real number is $123.5 trillion, going up by almost $10 trillion a year. That's the hole we're in, ladies and gentlemen.
Stunning. Dr. Taylor, I've made the statement that the president's failed economic policies and unnecessary, massive spending, some necessary with the COVID situation and weathering that, but a lot unnecessary, in my opinion. Can you connect the dots between fiscal policy and is there a connection between the last 2 years of this president's economic agenda, fiscal policies, and the inflation and the interest rates and the sputtering and sinking economy into recession? I yield to you, Mr. Taylor.
Yes, there is a connection, and I've written about it, testified in other committees about this already. The Fed got behind the curve. I don't think there's much disagreement about that at this point, and they're beginning to catch up, but they still have a ways to go. I think that, I mentioned monetary policy in my opening remarks, because I think it's a very important part of the fiscal side. So it's a very important thing. What I tried to do as well in my formal opening is refer to the president's budget. It has deficits growing as far as the eye can see. It has spending increases. It has tax revenue increases. These are the things that I think we need to address. We've been successful in the past by addressing those. So I urge the committee to take this on and have substantive description of what we need to be doing. I outlined a little bit in my testimony, but I think it's important to get this deficit out of the picture as much as possible. And that requires some adjustments on revenues and adjustments on spending as well.
I think the gentleman, I have so many questions in so little time, so I'm going to yield to my ranking member, Mr. Boyle, for his questions.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the idea of balancing the budget in 10 years, because some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have committed to that. Speaker McCarthy has made that as a goal. But at the same time, they've also made as a goal no tax increases and no changes to Social Security, Medicare, defense. I referenced this in my opening statement to Dr. Zandi. Given the analytics that Moody's did on this kind of a proposal a couple weeks ago, can you talk about what level of cuts would have to go to everything else government does if you were to attempt to pursue a policy like that?
And I think the CBO actually released a memo very recently documenting the severity of the cuts that would be necessary to achieve a balanced budget 10 years from now under the restrictions that you articulated. And, you know, pretty clearly it's not realistic. It would require a complete cut of all discretionary non-defense spending to achieve that. And that probably understates things in the sense that it's a static score, meaning it doesn't account for the impact of those changes on the economy and what that would mean for revenue, what that would mean for the automatic stabilizers and spending. So it's probably not even possible to achieve that over a 10-year period. And moreover, given the current state of the economy, the high inflation, the high interest rates, the vulnerabilities to the economy, significant cutting at this point in time, you know, if it were any time in the near future, I think would be the fodder for a recession. And you articulated kind of the fallout in terms of jobs and unemployment, and it would be quite significant. So I don't think that proposal is at all feasible or realistic.
Thank you. And Moody's projected 2.5 million job losses as well as a recession in 2024 if that sort of policy
Exactly.
were to come about. Let me pick up on the debt ceiling. Can you begin to describe what the consequences would be if for the first time in American history we breached the debt ceiling?
There's short, immediate consequences and longer-term consequences. The immediate consequence, I think under any scenario would be, we would go into recession, it would be severe, financial markets would be upended, we would have turmoil in markets. As I mentioned earlier, particularly in the context of the current fragility in the banking system, financial system more broadly that exists already today. So my sense is that if you want to kind of make it more concrete, if you remember back to TARP, that was the bailout package that was passed during the financial crisis, $700 billion package for banks, vehicle industry, and housing. Congress voted that down initially, and when that happened, markets tanked. You know, equity prices fell, credit spreads gapped out, and of course, it was so harrowing to watch. I can remember just watching the TV at that time. It was very harrowing. Congress immediately reversed course and passed TARP. That's the same kind of dynamic in the near term that would, I think, happen here.
What would be the effect on the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency?
It'd be significantly diminished. How could it not be? I mean, the reason why the rest of the world wants to put their savings into dollars as a reserve currency is because they feel it's money good. That if they, if they hold dollars, hold bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds, that they're going to get their money back on time with no delay, as is in their agreement with the U.S. Treasury. If we break that, then interest rates will be higher for forever, and the interest expense to us would be higher, and our fiscal problems more significant, and governments would not want to hold the dollar to the same degree as a reserve currency. They'll look for other ways of other currencies to hold their reserves in.
And let me, my time is about to expire, so can you reference this a little bit in your testimony? There's a bill that was passed out of committee recently, so-called debt prioritization. How would the rest of the world and the markets interpret this? Would they interpret it as legitimate, or would they, in fact, interpret it as basically default by another name?
They view it as it's the U.S. Treasury bond I invested in is not money good. I'm not going to get my money on time as is agreed to. They would stop buying bonds, which would already send interest rates up because foreign investors are big purchasers of bonds, and then ultimately start selling bonds, depending on how things kind of unfold. But they would not remain as investors in U.S. Treasury, certainly not to the degree that they are right now.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank my friend from the Commonwealth and yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Tom McClintock.
Well, actually, most states have such a provision in their constitutions, and Ben Bernanke credited that provision with confidence in their bonds, but that's not what I want to talk about. Mr. Zandi, from your testimony, it sounds like you believe our fiscal policy is generally on the right track, especially the major spending programs over the last few years, although you think we need to raise taxes to reduce the deficit. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I would say.
Mr. Taylor,
Okay.
what's the history of tax revenues in this country? My understanding is that regardless of tax rates, tax revenues are historically amazingly stable at between 13 and 19% of GDP. Is there a natural limit to the percentage of GDP we can actually tax?
The limit is the effect on the economy. And you have a responsibility to make sure the economy doesn't tank. And so that's the limit.
And at least going as far back as World War II, we've never exceeded about 19% of GDP. So are we pretty much at that limit now?
We are very close. That's very close.
Mr. Hodge, I know of only three ways of paying for government spending. Current taxes, which reduce current productivity. Borrowing, which crowds out the capital market that would otherwise be available to lend to consumers wanting to make consumer purchases. It runs up interest costs and has to be redeemed ultimately as future taxes. And of course, inflation that hollows out people's savings and earnings. Are there any other way to pay for spending?
No, Congressman.
So, to borrow a Clinton maxim, it's the spending stupid.
There's only one place to get the money for federal spending, and that's from American taxpayers and the private economy.
Inflation is caused by too many dollars chasing too few goods. When this administration took office, inflation stood at 1.4%. The Democrats then printed and spent trillions of dollars that we didn't have. Inflation in the last 25 months is up about 15% total, I believe. Does that mean that a savings account of $100,000 the day that Joe Biden took office is now worth about $85,000 in actual purchasing power?
Sadly, that's true, and I agreed with economists like Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who
they were
attribute they said the American Rescue Plan was going to cause inflation, and it certainly did.
Yeah, they were warned by many economists.
They were warned.
Not by Mr. Zandi, but by many others.
Yeah.
Does that also mean that a $50,000 annual income the day that Joe Biden took office it would now purchase about $42,500? So that's basically a tax of $7,500 on annual savings and $15,000 in that $100,000 savings account that a person's.
You've hit on the point here. Inflation is a tax on American people and their livelihoods and their standard of living. And right now, inflation is clawing away at their living standards.
The day that Biden took office, the southern border was under control. Mexico policy had slowed phony asylum claims to a trickle. Border wall was nearing completion. ICE was enforcing court-ordered deportations. That very day, Joe Biden reversed these policies. And since then, 1.9 million illegal aliens have been admitted to the country in violation of law. And while the Border Patrol has been overwhelmed with that, another 1.2 million known gotaways evaded them. Now, that's an illegal population admitted to this country in 25 months that is larger than the entire population of the state of Arkansas, a state with 4 congressional seats, in 25 months. How does that affect the income of working Americans?
Well, number one, we have the challenge of trying to care for these people and the demands that it's putting on the poor folks.
That's the
in
impact on
Texas.
taxpayers, on the
It's a big
social
impact
safety
on
net, on our schools, on our hospitals. What's it doing to the incomes of working American families?
Well, some would believe that the influx of low-income workers drives down the wages of current workers.
How can it be How can it be otherwise if you're adding millions of unskilled laborers?
Well, there's a lot of evidence, however, that we do need more workers in the United States because we have this gap.
3.1 million?
We need to have more skilled workers in the United States.
On Inauguration Day, the average price of gasoline was $2.39 a gallon. We were energy independent for the first time in decades. That afternoon, Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline, which today would have been completed and delivering 850,000 barrels of crude oil into American markets. He canceled oil exploration on federal lands. He's presided over a virtual moratorium on new drilling permits. One study estimates that if the Trump energy policies had remained in place, we'd be producing between 3 and 5 million barrels a day more oil. What are the implications of these policies on energy prices and economic growth?
Congressman, we're our own worst enemies when it comes to this. Here we were net exporters of oil in the United States. We could have solved Europeans' problems, both oil and gas, but I think this administration has gone the wrong direction and has caused the crisis that we now have with both of these things. It reminds me of the 1980s when we passed the windfall profits tax, which actually reduced domestic production and caused us to be more dependent on foreign oil. It's completely ridiculous.
We've done it to ourselves.
We did it to ourselves.
I thank the gentleman from California, and if I might be indulged, I saw a group of students come in. I couldn't be more delighted to have the next generation of Americans here. This is an important conversation, and we all, I think, agree this is a serious issue, and I don't think it will impact anybody more than the young people that are sitting here in this hearing room. So welcome, we're delighted to have you.
Mr.
And now to my friend, yes, sir.
Just
I
a
yield.
point of personal
Yes,
privilege.
you bet.
I think these young people are with the Constitution team from Cleveland High School in Portland, Oregon.
Wow.
Young people who are understanding how it works. They're amazing in terms of what they do, and we welcome them.
Hey, let's give them a round of hand. I thank my friend from Oregon, but now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The proposed Biden budget of $6.9 trillion is about 29% of the U.S. economy. The United States is less than 5% of the world's population and about 27% of the world's economy. A default on American debt would not only destroy the American economy with high recession, lost household savings, lost retirement savings, but it would drag the entirety of the world economy down with it. Past 5 recessions started under Republican administrations. July of 1981, July of 1990, March of 2001, December of 2007, in February of 2020. The national debt increased more rapidly under Republican administrations, under the past 4 administrations, an average rate of 10.2%, including $8 trillion under the previous administration, and the debt ceiling was raised by the very people that say that we have to do something about all of this. They did something. They contributed to the debt, and therefore have a moral responsibility to raise the debt ceiling to help the American economy. As has been said here by many, the best way to grow an economy is to invest in it. You know, we saw it in the 1990s under the Clinton administration. They had 4% economic growth for each year over 8 years. There wasn't budgetary deficits, there were budgetary surpluses. Those surpluses were taken by the next administration, a Republican administration, to provide tax cuts to the very, very wealthy on the faulty theory that trickle down would help grow the economy, and it didn't. So we just came off, horrible 3 years in the pandemic. Nobody was lining up for Russian and Chinese vaccines. It was the messenger RNA vaccine, which is the genetic material that tells a cell to make a protein, which is the active ingredient in the vaccine. 2 million Americans were saved because of that. The American economy was saved because of that. Yeah, we spent a lot of money, and inefficiently. Some $5 trillion, somebody said on the other side that too much money chasing too many goods created inflation. Guess what? Bloomberg Analytics forecasts that inflation at this time next year will be down to 2.5% from a high of 9.1% in July. The Inflation Reduction Act, somebody called that corporate welfare. The real corporate welfare, truthfully, is not the IRA. It's the IRS and tax avoidance. The previous administration's IRS commissioners said that we're losing. We're losing $1 trillion a year because of tax avoidance. Well, the IRS commissioner, that's what he said. So you look at, the Chips and Science Act. We talk real tough around here about China. Well, we need to talk a lot tougher. We've got to be tougher on ourselves about China. Today, there are 200 electric vehicle battery mega plants being constructed, and they'll be finished in the next 5 years. 146 are in China. 24 are in Europe, and 11 are in the United States. What is the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act intended to do? It's intended to accelerate United States manufacturing, friendshoring, reshoring, call it what you will. The bottom line is we need to make more things here. In 2 years of the Biden administration, he's created 12 million jobs. It's a pretty good record. The unemployment rate is the lowest it's been in 54 years. And we're accelerating the things that we made and sold to the rest of the world. Now they make and sell to us. So, a lot of bad news is being circulated through here, but this is an extraordinary country that does a lot of great things. And it's not the iPhone or TikTok that are the great products of American innovation. It's stuff like the messenger RNA. It's every technology in your cell phone. Touchscreen technology, voice-activated personal assistant, global positioning satellite, the internet. Guess who created it? Americans, through their investments in DARPA. And then Steve Jobs went and took all that technology that we paid for and made 1 billion smartphones in China. Look, let's be tough on China, but let's be tougher on ourselves about China. And to grow the American economy, you have to invest in it. And the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill are all intended to do that at a time when our economy took a major beating over the past 36 months. I'll yield back, sir.
I thank my friend from New York and now yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
I got over a little what Mr. McClintock went over. Could one of you guys give me a little bit history of debt as a percent of GDP, where we stand now compared to where we stood over the last 80 years?
Let's start from the beginning. In 1789, to defeat the most powerful military on earth, to achieve ratification of the constitutional amendment, which included assumption of all state debt to GDP was about 30%. It never exceeded 40%, no matter what, whether we were at war, peace, Great Depression, whatever, until we got to World War II. In World War II, it exceeded 100%, an all-time high, because we defeated the Axis powers, saved the free world, and avoided attack on the continental United States. After World War II, we pulled back spending dramatically, right-sized the military, made some targeted investments in human capital and physical infrastructure through the GI Bill, which my dad benefited from, and through interstate highway system. The economy grew much faster than the debt. Debt didn't go down. Economy grew much faster than the debt. We were down to 30% roughly of debt to GDP in 1980. It went up to defeat the Soviet Union and a variety of other things. We got back fiscal discipline in the 90s. When I became Comptroller General, 1998, it was 60%. When I left in 2008, it was 60. If you add debt held by the public and debt held by the trust funds, which are guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, 14th Amendment, the only thing that's guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, nothing else, we're over 120% of GDP. And we're headed up to close to 200% of GDP in the next 30 years if we don't get our act together. So the key is here, not where we've been, not where we are, where we're headed. Both Democrats and Republicans are responsible for where we are, but enough's enough. We're headed off a cliff.
Okay. Could you get, obviously, we're going deeper in debt every year. Could you comment a little bit on, well, first of all, is it true that next year our interest on the debt alone will cause our spending to go up $100 billion compared to this year?
That sounds about right. And within 10 years, we'll be spending more on interest than national defense. And the shocking thing is if you look at what the government's spending money on, and you compare that to the preamble of the Constitution, it's a total mismatch.
Is part of the problem that people around here don't understand the Constitution or what they can do? Do you think that's part of the problem? I keep hearing people say we're a democracy, for example.
Yeah, well,
which shows
my personal
fundamental-
view, and I've said this publicly, I think every member of Congress should be required to take an exam on the Constitution on Constitution Day in September and publish the results. And I'd be interested to see what the results would be.
Very good. There are some people who feel the answer is to increase taxes. Could you comment a little bit on the Laffer curve? In other words,
Well,
if we
I know
if-
Art Laffer. I mean, people take it to an extreme, okay? There's a point of diminishing returns, right? Let me just give you the bottom line. I'm a political independent, all right? There's a new four-letter word in fiscal policy. It's called math, all right? President Biden's proposed policy doesn't meet the test. What you articulated that is potentially being proposed by the Speaker doesn't meet the test, all right? The problem is primarily a spending problem, overwhelmingly, but not exclusively. We've waited too long to solve this problem. You can't grow your way out, you can't cut your way out, you can't tax your way out. You have to create a mechanism that will allow tough choices to be made where everything is on the table to differing degrees, all right? That's what you got to do. You will not solve the problem unless you do that, and you can't do it from Washington. You got to start with the people and end in Washington.
Okay. Could you comment on the degree to which spending must fall to begin to get us back on a potentially tenable track?
Well, I think the target needs to be debt to GDP. We need to set a target that we can reach in about 10 years, okay?
How about in the next 2 years? 'Cause I think 10 years is ridiculous. This place is not capable of sticking.
Well, it only does one-year budgets. That's part of the problem. But, yeah, that's part of the problem. But, look, I put out in my testimony that you need to cut 2024 spending at least $200 billion as a down payment. And I gave you specific ideas how to do that. It isn't that tough, okay? I mean,
So you believe it's reasonable, but let's just say discretionary spending. You believe it's reasonable to cut discretionary spending by $200 billion this year compared to last year?
Well, it's not all discretionary. I mean, the two things that I say is, number one, eliminate the emergency. All spending and subsidies associated with the COVID emergency, eliminate. It's hundreds. It's a huge amount of money. Secondly, eliminate all one-time spending items. There were lots of one-time spending items. You just do that, you get over $200 billion. Just do that, all right? And by the way, I'm on the Defense Business Board. Over time, there's plenty of ways to cut defense spending without compromising national security.
Absolutely.
Without compromising national security.
I think witness, and I thank the gentleman, but we're going to now yield 5 minutes to our colleague from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you mentioned $200 billion because I think it came up earlier that, and it's all about spending, you said, but of course there were tax breaks of $200 billion that went mostly to the wealthiest Americans. Just a comment. To the students, let me just say, I'm sure that you are aware that it is in our Constitution that we have the duty, the United States of America, to pay our debts. Put it simply, to pay the bills. And what's really important, and I think you can help us, is that what we're talking about, money that has already been spent, agreed to by Congress, and that we owe that money now, and that we should pay our debts. And I know that, Dr. Zandi, you talked about the debt ceiling, which of course has passed more than 70 times, and 3 times without any hullabaloo during the Trump administration. And now what we're seeing is that Janet Yellen has told us that we actually have already reached our limit, our Secretary of the Treasury, and that if we fail to pay our debts, that it can have pretty dramatic consequences, not only to the overall economy, but to individual Americans. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, Dr. Zandi. Right now, there are 40 million people who get the SNAP program. There are about 70 million Americans who are on Social Security. 65 million Americans on Medicare right now. And if we don't meet our obligation to pay our debts, it seems to me that we're going to see some real difficult times for the people who rely on those. I wondered if you could comment not only about what might happen to the individuals, but what kind of impact does that have on our overall economy? If so many millions of people now are unable to get the food on the table and the basic needs that they need to have met.
Yeah, obviously, it'd be an extraordinarily significant hardship, financial hardship on all Americans if we breach the debt limit. And if we do breach, my guess is that the Treasury is going to try to pay bondholders, and they can technically do that through another payment system. But then everybody else, Social Security recipients, SNAP recipients, rental assistance, the military, everybody else, they would not be able to prioritize those payments. So what the Treasury would do is they would wait till they raise enough cash to pay everyone in a given day. So everyone's going to get their money late. So everybody's going to, and over time, it's going to get later and later and later. So the first payment might be a day late. The next go around, it might be a week late. The next payment after that, a month late. So the most immediate effect is people that really need the cash to buy groceries, to pay their rent, to do the typical things that people do, will not have the cash to be able to do it. So obviously the hit to the economy would be enormous. And then there's all the financial market effects, right? Because investors would see this, stock prices would fall, we'd see interest rates ultimately rise, the value of the dollar would decline, that would add to inflationary pressures. It would be a significant hit to the wealth of all Americans, and we'd be and then ultimately we'd start losing jobs, unemployment would start to rise, we'd be in a very, very severe recession. So all of us would be hit hard by that kind of scenario, depending on how long it unfolds. Now, it's hard to imagine that one would go down that path, and if we actually went down the path, that we'd go down it for very long, because it would become very obvious to everybody that that was going to hurt everybody and made no sense whatsoever. But if you continue down that path, they hit the American people. Every American would be very serious.
You know, you say maybe it's just a day or a week. I just want to say, as someone who works very closely on issues that affect older Americans, for example, I want to tell you, or SNAP recipients, people who rely on it for their nutrition, you know, even those short delays may not mean a lot to some people. Oh, you know, we can, you know, wait the week. These are really critical problems for people who rely on these benefits. So let's see, am I out of time? Just about. So I want to thank you for illuminating that even more. Thank you so much, Dr. Zandi.
I thank the gentlelady from Illinois and yield 5 minutes to Mr. Bob Good from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you to our witnesses here. I agree with what my colleague was saying a few moments ago about the responsibility that we have as a House. We have primary responsibility for the power of the purse, if you will, and to we have responsibility to protect the ability of the federal government to borrow when necessary and to pay our debts, obviously, which is always absolutely necessary. And I would submit that a default will take place. A default will take place when we can no longer borrow, when we can no longer sell our debt, or when we can no longer make our payments. And so I would go to Mr. Walker, help us with that. When would we begin to reach that, do you foresee, when we would have difficulty borrowing, selling our debt, and/or making our payments on the debt?
First, only God knows, and God's not telling us. But let me touch on your issue. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation going around about the debt ceiling, okay? First, it's failed. It needs to be replaced with a debt-to-GDP approach, okay, which can succeed and has in other countries. Secondly, there's only one thing guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States financially. One thing, and that's debt and accrued interest on the debt. Nothing else is guaranteed. Social Security, Medicare, those are important, they're not guaranteed.
If I may interject, that's the only thing that's really mandatory, right?
Right. Secondly, as long as the Social Security and Medicare trust funds have bonds in them, then you can pay benefits on a timely fashion. And they do have bonds in them. Why? Because they are closely held debt, they are counted in the debt ceiling. So if you need cash, you end up just converting from intragovernmental bonds to bonds held by the public. It doesn't change the debt ceiling a dime, all right? So A, we're not going to default on our debt. We can't because of the Constitution. Secondly, we can pay Social Security and Medicare benefits, but you can't pay other things in a timely manner, all right? And if the Treasury says that they haven't been able to prioritize, then they better read the Constitution, okay? That's their job, okay? So you will have to make tough choices. Things won't get paid on time. But the bottom line is, we're not going to violate the debt ceiling. The question is, what are the conditions to raising it? And there should be conditions. We are out of control.
Yeah, the American people should be greatly concerned at the incompetency or perhaps the unwillingness to recognize the situation that you just described. To your point, we had the budget director, which is a funny term to apply to this administration. We had the budget director here just recently for our last hearing. And to what you were speaking about earlier, Mr. Walker, I asked her, do you know what our percent to GDP, debt to GDP is? And she did not know. She said it was 90-something percent. When I asked her, after I told her it was about 125%, and I said, when is the last time we were at that level of debt to GDP? She did not know, so I had to tell her that it was some 80 years ago at the end of World War II. And obviously, how would we absorb a crisis like that? How would we react to a crisis like that? How would we fund a real threat to the country when you come in with 125% of GDP? That also said, to the point you just made a moment ago, I led a letter to Janet Yellen, Secretary of Treasury, asked her, what is her plan to ensure we don't have a default, to prioritize payments, to prioritize spending? And she could not or would not answer that with the letter that she sent back to me. So Americans should have great concern about the incompetency or the lack of ability to recognize the problems that we do have. I want to move to Mr. Hodge for a moment. The president's budget assumes an inflation rate of 2.4%. You know, we're currently in the range of 6%. When you come out with a unprecedented $7 trillion budget, spending about $20,000 per American citizen just in a year's time, and projecting a $2 trillion deficit the first time, is there any reason to believe that might bring down inflation?
Oh, goodness, no.
Yeah. Can you speak to how we got to the inflation that we have and what the president's proposed budget might do to inflation?
Congressman, over the next 10 years, the president's budget is proposing to spend $82 trillion. I just let that sit out there. Let us absorb $82 trillion. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they're proposing to tax $65 trillion. Both are over the baseline. These are breathtaking. I was here 30 years ago when John Kasich was chairman, saying exactly the same thing, but the deficit was only $200 billion, a pedestrian $200 billion. All of the things that I outlined in my testimony about cutting spending and solving the entitlement problems were true then in 1995 as they are today. The failure to deal with those problems in the interim has brought us to this point.
Thank you, Mr. Hodge. I've exceeded my time, but that $82 trillion is about $1 million per citizen, or excuse me, per taxpayer, about $1 million per taxpayer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and now to the proud representative of the next generation of Americans here with us today, Mr. Blumenauer from Oregon. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate your approach in terms of seeing if there are facts we can agree on. I think there are a number of things. I also appreciate you providing a provocative panel. I'm listening to Mr. Hodge about selling the post office, the most trusted branch of the federal government, and the greatest source of rural and small town family wage jobs, eliminating the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the most trusted brand of American media and has a huge impact on rural and small town America. I welcome many of my colleagues to run with those suggestions, but I would rather sort of think about this notion of tough decisions. You know, Congress has mandated, some of my Republican friends from Florida, that the Navy continue to operate the next generation of battleships that don't work, that they don't want, at a cost of billions of dollars. I mean, there are things that we ought to be able to focus on and agree upon. In terms of reforming agricultural subsidies, there's been an interest to try and have more standards for poor people on nutrition programs. Yet, nearly 20,000 farmers have received commodity subsidies for 37 straight years of $1 million or more without an income limit. I would think this is something that conservatives and liberals ought to be able to zero in on and be able to get more value. In terms of health care, I mean, this is the big driver of the federal budget, and that we don't have to continue paying twice as much for health care that on an international scale is mediocre. And there are a number of things that I think we can roll up our sleeves and make a difference. I mean, one little thing that I'm working on in the Ways and Means Committee is to try and get some standards on some of these rip-off artists that have hospice programs that are shells, and they keep getting money. Now, I think these are things that we ought to be able to get our arms around, work on to get more value. One area that I would like to focus on, and Mr. Zandi, you've referenced, and some of our other witnesses, that there are going to be needs for more revenue. I would wonder, Mr. Zandi, Dr. Zandi, if you could focus on having people pay the taxes they already owe. The tax gap that is estimated at approaching $500 billion a year. It's interesting, the wealthiest Americans have the highest level of tax evasion. The top 1% forget to report $163 billion a year that's due and payable under the existing system. Could you comment on what impact it would have if we actually would collect the taxes due and payable in terms of our fiscal health and in terms of voluntary compliance of our tax system?
I think you make a good point. I think it's pretty clear, and I think there's a lot of evidence of tax evasion, and that with greater enforcement by the IRS that needs the funding to be able to engage in that greater enforcement, we can raise that revenue, stop the evasion, or curtail it, and generate a significant amount of revenue. How much is very uncertain. There's a lot of debate and discussion around that, and some of the tax revenue that would be generated is being used to pay for the Inflation Reduction Act, which is paid for. If you look at the IRA, it is paid for through other sources of revenue over the next 10 years, and actually significantly reduces budget deficits in the subsequent 10 years. This is just based on CBO scores, static scores. So, excuse me, some of what you're talking about has been used, but I do think there's a tremendous opportunity there. And I think to your broader point, it just goes to fairness. And I think if people feel like everyone's paying their fair share, more likely they'll pay as well and won't evade taxes. So hard to know, what that means in terms of dollars and cents, but it certainly is intuitive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your courtesy.
You bet. I thank the gentleman from Oregon, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Blake Moore.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member. I'm not usually the prop guy, so this is a new experience for me. But I want to tell a story, and I want your input to look back over the last 100 years of our nation and have history be either dictate what can happen, or, in my opinion, what could happen, and I hope that and what should happen as we look at what we've gone through. Look, I want to focus on three time frames: World War II, the late 90s, and right now. I think all three are a very important inflection point in what we've got going on, and I just wanted to hear primarily from Mr. Walker, but I think all Mr. Hodge and Mr. Taylor, you all played a significant role in the late 90s, and look forward to your perspective. Look, particularly Mr. Walker, World War II, 106% of GDP. You have gross GDP. You have public held by debt held by public. Different factors. We had 100. Let's just go with 106% of debt to GDP. Thanks for focusing on that metric. We all know that's what we should be talking about always. What did we do? What were the important aspects post World War II that got us to be able to drive this debt to GDP down in the right trajectory?
We restored fiscal responsibility. We dramatically downsized the military, obviously. At the same point in time, we adopted a number of pro-growth policies. We had selected investments in human capital, the GI Bill. We had selected investments in critical infrastructure, but they were investments that generated a positive return on investment. They weren't just called investments, they actually were investments. We do a lot of things around here that we call investments, but they don't generate a positive return on investment, which is important to keep in mind. And so we grew the denominator much faster than the numerator. We didn't pay off any debt. That's why debt to GDP went down. And the metrics really that we ought to focus on are debt to GDP, spending as a percentage of GDP, revenue as a percentage of GDP, mandatory spending as a percentage of the budget, and interest as a percentage of the budget. Those are the things that we ought to focus on like a laser.
We saw this starting to uptick leading up to in the 90s, the decade, and you saw, as you did that, so you're saying that people responded to what was going on at the time. And in the 90s, there was a group of people led by, like you mentioned, former chairman of this committee, John Kasich, Senator Bob Dole, as I understand, was impactful. You had Director and Secretary Leon Panetta, at that time was President Clinton's budget director. Those individuals came together and they achieved a balanced budget. Any takeaways from that type of leadership?
First, the last fiscally responsible president in this country was Bill Clinton, and the one before him was George Herbert Walker Bush. We haven't had a fiscally responsible president since then. You had divided government. Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House. President Clinton obviously was a Democrat. John Kasich was budget chair. I was Comptroller General during that period of time.
And I'll ask this to all three of you gentlemen. I'm going to give you a chance here. One major concern I have was with the letter that came back from President Biden yesterday. It says, no, we need a clean debt ceiling. We need to just raise this without any negotiations. Did President Clinton engage in good faith negotiations in the late 90s to restore some fiscal sense of responsibility? Mr. Taylor?
So this is, you got to get rid of that thing. It could be on the red. That's what you guys got to do. There's no reason why you can't. Look at the history.
Thank you. That's the point I'm trying
Let's
to
do
make
it.
here. We had another inflection point where we have to respond to what's going on. We had a record of spending during the pandemic. We have an opportunity, I know there's bipartisan support, to be able to do what other leaders of our nation have done in the past and address this issue and get us going back down. You have, Mr. Hodge, please.
I want to be careful, I want you to be careful about taking too much out of the 1990s.
Understand.
The way the reason the budget balanced in the 1990s were two factors primarily. One was the drawdown in defense after the Cold War ended, where defense went from 6% of GDP down to 3% or 3.5%, and the run-up in Y2K with capital gains revenues that came flooding in, and accidentally 6 months before we balanced the budget, CBO was projecting $200 billion deficits as far as the eye could see.
Absolutely,
It was
yes.
an accident. The only
And with the dot-com busting, we recognized the revenues weren't
Yes.
really there. That was a bit of a,
There was not as much
Yeah.
fiscal discipline then as is often.
the planets aligned to make it happen, but the president was at least willing to negotiate. And we're not seeing that right now. It's a big, big concern for what we've got going on to be able to respond to post-pandemic. Again, COVID was tough, but it was no World War II, right? This wasn't the catastrophic event of World War II. We have an opportunity as leaders in this nation to address so we can get this going back in the right direction. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Utah, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Scott Peters from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I did have questions for Mr. Zandi about the debt ceiling that were asked before. I think it's a tremendously risky thing. I would say sometimes this committee can be performative, and I want to credit my friend, Chairman Arrington, and my friend, Mr. Boyle, for really trying to make this a policy committee, and I really appreciate that. I do agree with President Biden, we should do a clean debt ceiling. I also understand the realities that that's probably not in the cards right now. So I think we should think about what the components are of an extension. And I would like to talk a little bit about where we are with respect to Social Security. And Dr. Zandi, maybe you could tell us what happens if lawmakers fail to shore up Social Security Trust Fund before it becomes insolvent in 2035?
Well, it just adds to the instability of the system and the increasing angst of the population around their ability to.
Yeah, specifically the angst of the people who will have their benefits cut.
Exactly.
So,
Question that.
my understanding that about 12 to 16,000 for a typical couple retiring in 2035. For a low-income couple, it is 7 to 10,000. I guess, could we talk a little bit about the effect of a $10,000 cut to a low-income couple?
Yeah, obviously, that'd be a tremendous hardship. It's hard to imagine that would happen, right? Because
It is hard to imagine
Yeah.
that would happen, isn't it? I've had people say that to me so many times in this building.
it's not going to
But you
happen.
know what? If you wanted to cut Social Security, what you would do is do nothing. Look, we had all these young people in here before who probably don't even imagine that Social Security will be there for them. And I just want to acknowledge that it's time to do something about it. I also want to say that it is unrealistic to take tax pledges that no one under 400,000 will pay any more taxes, or Mr. Norquist, Grover Norquist's pledge, no one's going to pay any more taxes at all. I hope that's not, the people who are serious about this are not really thinking that that's the way to do it. I like the idea of a commission because what happens in this building is if you have any singular idea, and you go to the microphone, you could lose your job. So I think in many ways, having a discussion among experts about what to do, and I don't favor cutting benefits, frankly. I think, we recognize Social Security has been the most important anti-poverty program. But I recognize that we're facing an insolvency in a few years, and we have to do something about it. I think a commission would be constructive. Let me also suggest, though, that we may be asking too much of Social Security, because it is an anti-poverty program. It is not really the full retirement program that perhaps people understand it to be today. When this was formed, pensions were very common. And we have a problem with getting people to save in this country. that I think we should maybe think about remedying as part of a commission or as part of a total solution. Senator Coons and I had a bill a few terms back, Congresses back, called the Savings for the Future Act, which would have taken 50 cents of any increase in the minimum wage and required that for every hour someone works, 50 cents is put aside for them for their retirement. And if you had done that from when someone was 18 to when they're 65, that's about $600,000 that they would have to retire on. And I hope that we will think a little bit more abundantly about what the role of the government is and what the role of private savings is and how this Congress might incentivize private savings. Because I think that's got to be, really what we're talking about is not saving Social Security. Really, that's not the task. The task is a dignified retirement for people. That's more than Social Security. Mr. Walker, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, real quickly, thank you. First, if we do nothing on Social Security, benefits get cut 22 to 25% across the board. The reason that we reformed Social Security in '83 is because we were within weeks of having across-the-board cuts. That's not politically acceptable nor feasible. I used to be Assistant Secretary of Labor for ERISA, which oversees all private pension plans, defined contribution plans as well. You're right, Social Security is a floor. You can't live on the foundation. You have to build on it. Savings rates need to be higher. And one of the elements of the proposed Social Security reform that got 77% support was reform the defined benefit program to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, and have an automatic savings amount on top of that.
Right.
Automatic savings on top.
Dr. Zandi?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think just to make a point, that the real problem or issue is the aging of the population. I mean, that's inexorable. I mean, if you look at the share of the population that's over the age of 65, it's risen from 12.5% to 16.5% since the last time we had a balanced budget. And that's what's really putting pressure on the budget and what's going to continue to put more pressure going forward if you don't want to cut the benefit per beneficiary. And I don't think anybody wants to do that. Therefore, you need more revenue to pay for that increase in spending that will occur just because of the aging of the population.
Right. I'd also suggest that for that reason and for workforce reasons, we ought to really be having an honest conversation about immigration as a budget issue as well. But I'll have to leave that for another day. My time has expired. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from California and now yield to my fellow Texan, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, the students are gone because this conversation really affects them more than it affects people of our generation. But I couldn't help, they probably left because Blake Moore kept talking about the 1990s, and for me that'd be like talking about the 1800s. But remembering a day back in 1993 when my hospital administrator asked me to accompany him to a meeting of the Dallas Business Group on Health because they were going to hear from Senator Paul Tsongas. I kind of knew Senator Tsongas had run for president. I didn't think he had been successful, so I wasn't sure what the relevance was. But I also knew he was a Democrat, and I was pretty sure that our politics would not be aligned. However, this was the week after Bill Clinton had given his health security address in the Congress, a joint session, the House and Senate. Big deal. All the House members, senators were all there, and Bill Clinton unveiled his Health Security Act. And Senator Tsongas talked about this and said, I hope you watched the speech. It was a beautiful speech, beautifully delivered, not a dry eye in the House. And I was crying like a baby because he proposed 5 new entitlement programs, and we can't afford the ones we've got. And mind you, this is 1993. I was considerably younger. I wasn't thinking much about Social Security. I wasn't thinking much about retirement. But he got my attention when he said that. And with the help of some charts and graphs he had, he said, if we, at the level we are at, if we don't do something within the next 20 or 30 years, we are going to have a generation of Americans who will not be able to afford to pay the benefits that previous generations of Americans have promised themselves, and the result will be an intergenerational conflict, the likes of which this country has never seen. That has stayed with me over the years, and as we've worked through some of these problems in Congress, but also recognize the reason we're doing it is not to so much solve the problems of today, but the problems of tomorrow that these youngsters are going to face. And guess what? When it comes time to do whatever is required to prevent that 22 to 20% cut in Social Security, the next generation of Americans may not be willing to do that. They may look at their pay stub and say, you know what, I'm already paying 85% of my paycheck to someone I've never met. I'd just as soon not pay any more, thank you very much. So I just wondered, and we've got a brilliant panel in front of us, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that concept of, at some point, the next generation of Americans may not be able to sustain us in the style to which we've become accustomed.
We're all reaching for the button at the same time.
We'll just go down the road.
Congressman, I just returned from Europe, and the payroll taxes that support the welfare systems in Europe, the retirement systems, are over 30%. So today, in the United States, workers and employers split 12.65% on the payroll taxes. Imagine more than doubling that. Is anyone on this committee ready to endorse a 30% or higher payroll tax in order to afford these welfare or retirement benefits? That's the question you need to ask yourself. And I don't think anyone here is ready to do that.
It'd be a career-ending injury.
Yes.
One thing I love seeing the students. I teach hundreds of students. They're freshmen, sophomores. It's a exhilarating experience, by the way, to be in touch with the younger people, because that's what we're talking about. But I see these numbers, 2% growth. I mean, that's terrible. These budget numbers are astounding, 25% of GDP. The chart that the gentleman from Utah put up is astounding. Why not address those issues? There's a lot of factors that go into all of them. But I think if we look at these totals, we'll do something about that. We just can't let that exist.
Yes, sir.
Two things. For the first time in the history of the United States, 78%, all-time high, it's never been over 50, of voters believe that life for their children will not be as good as theirs. That is immoral, and it's largely because of this. Secondly, the frustration in Social Security, we can exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans. Because seniors think they're going to get taken advantage of. That's not right. It's not politically feasible. Young people think they're going to get nothing. We can reform the program, gradually over time, make it solvent, sustainable, secure. Everybody gets more than they think they're going to get. I call that a win. But we were delaying.
Yeah, Dr. Zandi.
Well, I would point out that I think there are sources of revenue that we can tap that would have very modest, minor impacts on economic growth. The corporate tax rate would be a good example of that. So right now, as you know, under the TCJA, that was rolled from 35% marginal rate down to 21%. And very hard to see any beneficial impact from that, at least the academic studies that I've seen.
We are collecting more taxes than we've ever collected or ever expected to collect, even in spite of the pandemic. And that was the testimony of the CBO director. He said we never anticipated collecting this level of taxes after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So thanks to our colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee
But
who made that happen.
according to the CBO, every percentage point increase in the corporate tax rate would generate close to $75–80 billion over a 10-year
Gentleman's
period.
time has expired. I'd like to recognize Mr. Kilty from Michigan for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing, and thanks to the panel. While we may not agree on everything, I'm impressed with, I had to step out briefly, but everything I've heard, I'm impressed with the quality of this panel, so thank you for helping to assemble it. And Mr. Zandi, this may allow you to perhaps expand on the points that you were beginning to make. Congress has taken on some of these issues, and clearly not to the extent that we need to, and not in as full a fashion as necessary, but we have made some progress in terms of the effect on the American people, cutting out-of-pocket costs, for example, when it comes to health care, capping the out-of-pocket costs for insulin, for just example, legislation that I helped write that caps that out-of-pocket at $35 a month. For seniors, the way we wrote it, it would apply to all insurances, would have been, I think, an important step. Making recommended vaccines free for seniors. These are helpful in terms of the way this all translates to the kitchen table. But we're also allowing, for the first time, Medicare to negotiate drug prices. The insulin cap is going to save, significant money. I want to kind of get right to a question. The Inflation Reduction Act was comprised of lots of pieces, some of which did really translate to help to these American families, and also, whether people want to accept it or not, had a positive effect on the national deficit. There are some who believe that we should just outright repeal that entire piece of legislation. All the benefits that would go to families would be gone. The economic fiscal benefits to the federal government would go along with it. I disagree with that approach. So, Mr. Zandi, I wonder if you might just zero in on that specific area. How does expanding Medicare's ability to negotiate prices and resulting in savings to the federal fisc, how does that improve the fiscal state of our country, and what would be the implications of repealing it?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, a place to look for spending restraint. So we have a fiscal problem, we need tax revenue, and we need restraint. And if you look at the budget, most of the growth in spending is really around the cost of medical care. It goes to the Medicare program and the Medicaid program. So we really need to think about how to reduce the growth rates in the cost of medical care. And I do think the steps taken in the Inflation Reduction Act around allowing for negotiation around the price for prescription drugs goes a long way to doing that. And it's also only a part way to doing that. I mean, it's quite limiting the number of drugs that will fall under the IRA negotiations. You have to wait, you know this better than I, 9, 13 years before you can do that. It only applies to Medicaid and Medicare, which together account for about 40% of all drug spending. So there's the other 60% of private plans that are spent on drugs. So I think this is a fruitful area for further exploration to see if we can't create more competition and get the cost of growth down in the price of drugs, prescription drugs. Rolling that back, as you say, would be going in the wrong direction. It would raise spending in the future, add to our future budget deficits, and not help our long-term fiscal situation. So I think that is a great place to look for the kind of spending restraint we need to address our long-term fiscal situation.
Thank you. And I wonder if you might now just turn briefly, in the minute or so remaining, to the question on Social Security. I've heard conversation about it. Social Security is a little bit like the weather. Everybody complains about it. Nobody ever does anything about it. In this particular case, there are some of us who have stepped forward with what we think would be a plan worth considering, Social Security 2100, a way to increase benefits, strengthen the long-term viability. It comes in a couple of different forms, so I'd prefer not to have somebody pick on one version or the other. But doing so by dealing with the cap on Social Security taxation and applying that tax to income above that $147,000, actually above the $400,000 level. I wonder if you might just comment on that or any other approach that you might take that would avoid the cliff that we might face on Social Security.
Yeah, that's exactly where I would go. I think we need more revenue. I mentioned higher corporate tax rates. Just roll back halfway the cuts that occurred under TCJA, and we would generate, according to CBO, at least $1 trillion over a 10-year period. The other source of revenue would be exactly this. They would go right to Social Security. As everyone knows, there's a cap on the income that's taxed. And I would probably go to 400K and above. And I'd say anybody making if you're over 400K and above, you pay that 12.4% tax. And then over time, you'll see the cap continue to rise as it currently does under law, and then we'd be paying on those earnings. And all we're doing is going back to the original Social Security system where when Social Security was put on the planet in the 30s, 93% of all earnings were taxed. That's not the case today because of the skewing of the income and wealth distribution that we're suffering with. So all we're doing is going back to the future, to the original intent of Social Security. And if you do that, you solve a lot of problems with the Social Security Trust Fund, and also you generate a lot of revenue that will address our long-term fiscal problems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zandi, and to the panel, to all of you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Yakim from Indiana for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today and sharing your insights on the current fiscal state of our nation. It's been talked a lot about the future of our children. It is the single biggest concern that I have for our children is the fiscal state of our nation. I can think of no higher responsibility that we have as members of Congress to ensure that the United States of America passes on to the next generation a country that is in good fiscal condition, and make sure that it's more secure and better economically than the country that we inherited. And that's what concerns me so much about President Biden's budget request. It shows a complete disregard for the concept of fiscal responsibility. And instead, it doubles down on the same policies that supercharged generational inflation. And we've been seeing that generational inflation ever since he took office and we started spending a few $1 trillion per year more than what we're taking in. It also expands on an already bloated bureaucracy and suffocates businesses with more burdensome regulations. It disincentivizes work, and it sticks the IRS on unsuspecting middle-class Americans. And that's not a future that I want to leave for my children, nor is $48 trillion in national debt. So my first question is directed to Mr. Walker. Under President Biden's budget, discretionary spending will increase by 6% over fiscal year 2023. Can you explain the negative economic implications of consistently increasing the size of federal spending at a faster rate than the growth of GDP?
Well, there's an interrelationship here. With additional spending results in additional deficits in debt. With additional deficits in debt, under recent monetary policies, we've had a very loose monetary policy. It's now tightening up some. That resulted in excess inflation. Excess inflation results in higher interest rates. Higher interest rates results in a number of factors, including the fact that contributed towards the failure of some recent banks, if you will. So these things are all interconnected. Let me just mention two things quickly. Current political leadership is failing to discharge their fiduciary and stewardship responsibilities. That's a bipartisan comment. I'm an independent, okay? Secondly, Indiana was the first state in 1957 to pass an application for a convention of states, not a constitution, a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment. That's going to solve the problem. Debt to GDP constitutional amendment, please look at HCR 24, please join in. You're not going to solve this problem without a constitutional change.
Can you comment even more on the negative consequences of these fiscal issues on American families? Just think of like a middle-class family. Can you talk more about their issues?
Well, you know, the cruelest tax of all is inflation. You have no choice, you don't vote, it just happens, right? It disproportionately adversely affects poor people. It disproportionately affects middle-income people. It disproportionately affects people who are on a fixed income. Since in the last 2 years, inflation has been 15%. So, you know, do the math. If you look at wage increases have gone up, but much less than inflation. So people are losing purchasing power during that time.
The president's budget over the next 10 years, he states that they reduce the federal deficit by $3 trillion. Is that actually the case, Mr. Walker?
I think the way that that's calculated as compared to if we continue to spend, and I don't like to use the term drunken sailors, having taught at the Naval Academy. I think it's an insult to drunken sailors. But you know, it's like we said, we cut the deficit dramatically. Well, we cut it because we didn't end up spending a lot of extraordinary amounts that were due to COVID, right? I mean, what we have to focus on is the base budget. The base budget's out of control. That's what we got to focus on.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. And Mr. Hodge, did the American Rescue Plan increase or decrease the amount of inflation in our economy?
Well, I would agree again. As I mentioned earlier, I agree with Larry Summers and Jason Furman and other economists who warned against that legislation and the effect it would have on inflation. And I think that all of those warnings have borne out, and we're seeing the effects today, and that those effects will carry on long into the future.
And the president's budget projects 2.4% inflation next year. Do you think that that is a reasonable projection?
Not at all.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you and welcome. Appreciate your time today. I think even though there's a lot of talk about doom and gloom, I do believe that we have to give some acknowledgement to how resilient our economies are at this point. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of talk about there being a soft landing or no landing, and then, now a hard landing, with the worry of the credit and uncertainty. However, you counter that with China's rebounding, bottlenecks are disappearing, and energy prices falling. Nevertheless, despite how we're positioning ourselves right now, I do believe you're going to find members on both sides of this dais that are absolutely concerned with reducing our deficits. And we got to understand, though, that when we do have these discussions, it can't just be about relying on spending cuts. We have to at least talk about increasing revenues. And so I think there are certain spending cuts that we can have to wasteful programs. At the same time, we can raise revenues that in certain areas that will have little impact on our economy. And so, Dr. Zandi, where do you think we can get most bang from our buck, either on the spending cut side or on the revenue raising side, or both?
I agree we need both to address our long-term fiscal problems. I think we need to focus first on revenue. We talked about a couple of things: higher corporate tax rate, just roll back the corporate tax rate halfway from the cuts that occurred under TCJA. So they're currently 21%. Let's take it back to 28. That would raise about $1 trillion, according to CBO, over a 10-year period. We talked about taxing earnings, the payroll tax to help Social Security above $400K. That would raise another $650, $700 billion, again, according to CBO, over a 10-year period. The net investment income tax, this is in the president's budget. I think it's a very good idea, 3.8% to 5%. And there are earnings that are not taxed through pass-through corporations and other entities that should be taxed. That's another $650 billion. Those are three ideas that I think would go a long way to helping the long-term fiscal situation of the nation. And the negative economic consequences of those would be on the margin, because you're taxing large corporations and high-income, high-net-worth individuals, and the impact that would have on their behavior would be small. I'm not saying it would have no impact. It will, right, but it will have a small negative consequence and go a long way to addressing a long-term fiscal situation. In terms of spending, I think you need to go to the cost of medical care, because if you look at the budget forecast, it really is the cost of Medicaid and Medicare, and you don't want to cut, nobody wants to cut, nobody has the willingness to cut the benefits per beneficiary. It's just simply we're aging, and we're going to have a lot more people that are in Medicare and in Social Security, and so we need to think about how to reduce the growth rate of the cost of medical care. And we talked a little bit about prescription drug negotiating prescription drugs. I think that's an excellent place to start in terms of working on those things.
Great. Dr. Zandi, you talked about automatic stabilizers, and you said that during the times that we were putting out many of the subsidies, we were guessing the right amount of aid that it would be. Could automatic stabilizers help us deploy the right amount of assistance in a future emergency?
Yeah, I think our automatic stabilizers really deserve a lot of focus among lawmakers. I mean, they've been put in place over time and haven't really been thought through. I mean, one example is unemployment insurance. That's a great example. Exactly. What a mess that has been. We relied very heavily on that during times of recession, and very much so in the pandemic. But it's state, federal kind of program, and there's a lot of issues, problems in executing on that particular automatic stabilizer. And there's so many good ideas and examples overseas of better design that if we just thought about this, we would have a system in place that would be much more supportive of the economy at much lower cost in times of crisis.
Great. Once again, gentlemen, thank you for being here. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I would like now recognize a gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for being here. I've got the list of questions and topics is long and distinguished that I'd love to dive into. But let me start with just a couple of them, and then I want to move to a bigger picture. Number one, and Dr. Taylor, if you could possibly address this, I would appreciate it. What we've seen back home is that people are having a harder time paying for groceries. They're having a harder time paying for gas. The cost of building new homes is absolutely through the roof. Everything that American families need and touch is going through the roof. Okay? At what point does the consumer run out of gas? And now we're seeing consumers do buy now, pay later programs for gas and groceries. At what point does the consumer run out of gas in all of this?
So you're right to point to these raising prices. We've been talking about it for a lot. It's slightly less than it was before, but it's still very high and is yet to be applied to everybody. I think what you can do about it is make sure that you have some responsibility of the Fed. They have to make the adjustments. But the fiscal side is part of this. These charts that your colleague from Utah put up are quite striking. Why not try to deal with that? That'll make it easier to deal with these inflation issues that you're pointing to. It's very important. It's not just monetary. It's fiscal and monetary together.
Yeah, but I just wonder, I mean, it just feels like when my constituents are hitting this ceiling right now, and you continue to drive the demand side of the equation with the excess, government spending. And look, my colleague from Pennsylvania, the ranking member, said we're just trying to get to balance by cutting. I would say we wholeheartedly disagree with that. A big part of this is about putting forth pro-growth policies that drive the economy. And why should we do that? Would everybody on this panel agree, just by nodding your heads, that we need to ask the very simple question in every policy we make is, does it put us in a more competitive position against the Chinese Communist Party? Is that fair? Do you think that we should be transferring wealth, build here in America, sell it around the world, transfer wealth from around the world to the U.S. to bolster our economy, our standard of living, and our fellow Americans? Is that fair? So the question that I have, if you look at what we did, or what my colleagues did in the Inflation Reduction Act, we now have an estimate from Goldman Sachs advising investors that this is a good place to park their money because the estimates now are over $1 trillion of expenditures. Not 271, but almost 1.2 trillion. That's a huge number. And then yesterday, the administration announced, and I think they're still working on some of this, that we now have this quote-unquote free trade agreement. We're gonna expand the definition of a free trade agreement by going around Congress and allowing the Treasury Secretary to do it, where foreign governments get the benefit of the Made in America tax credit for EV cars and batteries. I mean, this just absolutely boggles my mind. Mr. Hodge, how does transferring taxpayer wealth to countries that we don't have a free trade agreement with bolster American competitiveness and our standard of living?
Well, with all due respect, Congressman, the Inflation Reduction Act violates all international standards of free trade. And so the Europeans have a good case to make that it is a protectionist measure. It violates WTO standards.
But specifically, don't you think that
it is an internationally illegal act? They have a right to sue us under the WTO.
Okay. But at the core of it, Made in America tax credits, and we can debate whether or not these things are good or bad for the economy.
They're bad.
But I don't disagree with you. But the fact that we have them, okay, can we at least make sure that they benefit Americans and not foreign governments?
You cannot do that, sir, under the WTO, and it is bad policy to begin with. I mean, the whole premise of the Inflation Reduction Act is bad policy. It's corporate welfare at its worst. And in fact, you mentioned the Goldman Sachs. Look on page 8 of the Goldman Sachs study, and it shows you how bad of a corporate welfare this is. It lists all the companies that they think are going to benefit from it.
And by the way, on that same point, by the time you fold in all of these tax credits, it's going to be a net benefit to the largest corporate citizens in America and around the world. And all of the rhetoric about corporations having to pay their fair share, it just gets flushed down the toilet because you're giving a tax break to the very people that you're demanding pay a higher level. With that, and my time has expired, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas for 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Chairman, let me thank you and the ranking member for this insightful hearing. But let me lay as a premise that none of this enlightening testimony transpired during the Trump administration. No Republican was interested in speaking clearly and loudly about the Trump corporate giveaway that has basically put us in a sizable hole. And none of you have taken into account, if you will, the investment that has been done. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump, as president, started Buy in America very clearly. No voices were raised, no witnesses came on behalf of Republicans to speak against it. The only way we're going to be fair on this process is as we speak clearly, no matter who is in the majority. That is not the case at this point. We have a hysterical statement, cut spending in 2024. That means leave children along the highway of despair, impoverish people, no housing, no investment in education. Dr. Zandi, I'm going to question you in the backdrop of some of these points, but I ask unanimous consent to place in the record. The Guardian next expects prices to slow this year in sign that inflation is easing. May 29, 2023, I ask unanimous consent to put that in the record. Forbes magazine, February CPI report shows that inflation keeps falling, March 14, 2023. I'm not suggesting that we should not be here being serious about this issue, but let's be realistic and let's have all the facts. Now, as I question you, Dr. Zandi, allow me just a moment that I want to put on the record. You know, a budget is a vision for America. In the president's budget, he spoke to the horrors of gun violence. And I want to put on this record that we have yet to see the Republican budget. We've yet to see it. And yet I just came from standing again in front of the steps of the United States Capitol, mourning the mass murder that occurred in Nashville, Tennessee. 3 dead 9-year-olds, 3 wonderful adults are now having their families mourn. We cannot get an assault weapons ban. We cannot get universal background check. And guess what? The ending of all of this carnage saves money. Children dying, number one, is homicide. It saves money. If we begin to grapple with this violence that is taking over America. But we haven't seen the Republican budget, so we don't know whether they care about stopping gun violence or not. I know we do, because we put money in there for violence intervention, and we put money in there to increase safety as it relates to gun laws. But we can't move, because if we have people being affronted by not having an assault weapon on their kitchen table, enough is enough. Let me quickly just ask you, if I might, investment isn't, and can you answer the question, would we not consider the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act? And I want to give you an opportunity to respond to this so-called corporate piggy bank, if you will, and the CHIPS Act, which I'm so excited about, which is research and investment. Does that not give us investment? And yes, we have private sector partners. My last point, because my time is running, I want you to answer this all together. Could you dive into how devastating the present law is that we raise the debt ceiling? That's the process. Prospective legislation, we can look at if it makes sense. We'll need a lot of economists to tell us that we should do a balanced budget in the United States of America. I want my Republican friends to understand that this country is a rainy day umbrella for crisis in our states. Do you know what happened in Mississippi? No one is going to be able to help them with 25 dead but the United States. So this question of debt ceiling, the threat of not raising it, if you can do a deep dive to say how devastating that is. First, the question of investment and how that impacts. You might want to comment on my articles that I just gave you on inflation. And then, of course, and forgive my voice, and then, of course, the deep dive on the question of debt ceiling having to be raised. Thank you.
I'd say your voice is very strong. Then, horse or not, it's a very strong statement. Well, on the investment, I concur. I think the infrastructure legislation, the CHIPS Act, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, taken in their totality, will be positive to long-term economic growth, address some of our pretty obvious geopolitical limitations when it comes to the chip supply chains that were so problematic during the pandemic, and also in terms of our relationship with China, very, very important. And I think it is very clear that climate change is a very serious issue. You can see it in, increasingly in the climate change and the impact that's having. So I concur with that. In certainly very positive long-run investments. And generally, if you look at all the pay-fors that are in them, it's largely paid for, at least on a static basis. And again, I'm using CBO estimates for that. Of course, now with the debt limit, I think that's just pretty clear that just has to be raised. It's an anachronistic law that is not helpful. It's very counterproductive, and it just needs to be raised without drama. Any drama in the current environment would be highly counterproductive, and particularly in the current environment when everyone's on edge with what's going on in the banking system. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to go down any different path than let's just raise the debt limit and move on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now yield myself 5 minutes for questioning. And I want to few random comments, maybe. Go back, Mr. Walker, to some of the comments you made. You talked about heading off a cliff. You mentioned the decline of the Roman Empire. And I'd like to just put a little more context on that. We can look at history at the rise and fall of nations and empires. And you mentioned the Roman Empire. We can look at the Dutch Empire. We can look at the British Empire. We can look at Chinese dynasties that have risen and fallen. And you compare where we are now, and it's pretty hard to say that we're not in a potentially declining. And I think it's going to be incumbent on us to think about what the future generation will say about us as policymakers here at this time. Will we be able to reverse that decline? Because every time there's been a decline, you saw another rising world power. You saw political instability and incivility, and almost, maybe most importantly, you saw an expansion of the money supply, continuing reliance on the central government, and then the loss of the reserve currency as a result of fiscal policy. And it's pretty easy to see a pathway forward along those lines. Students were here earlier today. I don't know that let me say one other thing. These cycles do not happen in a lifetime. They generally happen over a period of 75 years or 100 years or hundreds of years. And so, whereas we look at the world through a lens of what we've experienced in our own lifetimes, that's not what's about to happen historically. So what we have coming up in the next few decades will be different from what we have historically, will probably be different from what we've experienced in our lifetime. So I guess the question, Mr. Walker, is you mentioned a commission where we have this conversation with the American people. I'm not sure that the American people really understand what happens if this decline continues. How would you talk about that, and how can we make that more clear to the American people?
Well, first, there are four things it takes to be a superpower: global economic power, global diplomatic power, global military power, global cultural influence. We have it today. The question is, are we going to have it in the future? The leading indicator on the way up, the leading indicator on the way down is economic power. If you can't put your finances in order, you will lose economic power. If you lose economic power, you'll lose the others. Facts are clear and compelling. History shows that we're not doing the right thing. You have to do three things.
What does that mean to the average American today? What does the future look like if Americans?
Well, Alice Rivlin and I had forums with demographically representative groups of voters to show them, here's where we've been, here's where we are, here's where we're headed, here's what the potential consequences. Very slow economic growth, higher inflation, less opportunity, okay? Gradual decline in our diplomatic influence, gradual decline in our military capabilities. In addition to that, moving away from the dollar. Right?
It would, and I'm going to cut you off. It would be potentially each generation doing worse than the generation before, and have a dramatic impact on people's lives and freedom potentially as well. I want to also talk. There's this discussion about the debt ceiling, and the Democrats are fond of saying that we have to raise the debt ceiling, and I completely agree with that. Nobody is going to default here. But my question back is, because I've heard, we've had some really good discussion. I've agreed with what the ranking member has said when he said, if you take Social Security, Medicare, taxes, and military off the spending, off the table, there's not much left. We have to have a robust discussion about what it's going to take to save the country and move the country in the right direction. I think Democrats today recognize that we need to do that. So my question back would be, why not at this inflection point of the debt ceiling have a serious discussion? So why shouldn't we talking about the conditions to move forward and to raise the debt limit? So that would be my question to Democrats who are accusing Republicans of wanting to default. That will not happen. We want to have a serious conversation about what direction it takes the country. And then I want to talk just very briefly about the commissioner. I know I'm out of time. You want to gavel me down, but just very briefly. We had a commission in Pennsylvania when I was the chair of the Education Committee that looked at a difficult problem, and we did exactly what Mr. Walker recommended, and that is went out to the public and had a conversation about tough issues. And we found what you said today, and that is that people are ready to recognize a difficult problem, and they're ready to have a conversation about the tough decisions that need to be made to go forward. And so, if an outcome here would be we have some commission that either looks at the mandatories or, even more importantly, looks at how we can put us on the right path, I think that's a discussion, and it would need to be a discussion that's had with the public to let everyone know the situation that we're in. With that, I have no time to yield, but we'll go to, let's go to the ranking member of the Education and Workforce Committee, Mr. Scott. Oh, you want me to?
That's fine.
I didn't see Mrs. Wexton was here.
It's Wexton.
Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't see Ms. Wexton here. We'll go to Ms. Wexton of Virginia.
Deferring
for
to my
5
colleague
minutes of
from
questioning.
Virginia, if he wants to go first, you can go first, Mr. Scott. Somebody please go.
I'll go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I get, having been here, I think probably longer and probably the only one here that actually voted on the Clinton 93 budget, I get a little concerned about revisionist history. Because we're talking about being lectured by Republicans who, ever since Kennedy, every Democratic presidential administration has left office with a better deficit situation as a percentage of GDP than they inherited. Everyone without exception. And every Republican since Nixon has left office with a worse deficit situation than they inherited without exception. President Trump was on the way to doing that before the pandemic. President Biden is on the way to fulfilling that trend. And yet we're lectured time and time again from the same group. We talk about, I also get a little anxious when people try to give Republicans credit for what happened during the 90s, and as if John Kasich was responsible for balancing the budget. The 93 budget passed with no Republican votes in the House, no Republican votes in the Senate. Al Gore broke the tie in the Senate. It was a one-vote margin. The last vote was cast by Marjorie Tagolas-Brzezinski, and they started a chant, "Bye-bye Marjorie," for casting that vote. By the time Kasich got involved to balance the budget, the deficit was virtually eliminated. And yet, you try to take credit for it. In 2001, when President Clinton left office, the projection, you can disparage the projections, but you can ask the head of the CBO about his projections. Projection was that we're going to pay off the entire debt held by the public by 2008, put all the money back in the trust funds by 2013. President Bush came in, 2 tax cuts not paid for, 2 wars not paid for, prescriptive drug benefit not paid for, and all of a sudden, surprise, we're back in the ditch. And yet we're being lectured by that group. Now we have a situation where we have President Biden is reducing the deficit. He's already done $1.7 trillion. Compared to what? Compared to doing nothing, he's improved the deficit, and he's proposed $3 trillion more reduction in the deficit, and we have nothing to compare it to because there's no Republican budget. Now, the reason we don't have a Republican budget is because the numbers don't add up. You want to take out Social Security and Medicare and defense. You got to take out interest on the national debt. Next big item is Medicaid. Now, Dr. Zandi, Medicaid, people kind of think of low-income children. Where's most of the money in Medicaid? Where does most of the money in Medicaid go? Isn't it true that it goes to nursing homes? Yeah, that's correct. Okay, so if you do any meaningful cuts in that, people are going to have to leave nursing homes, and you figure that out. What would a budget look like if you protected Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, defense, interest on the national debt? What would a budget look like?
Well, I think you're down to about 3.5% of GDP. So it gives you, that's the discretionary non-defense budget is 3%-ish of GDP. The total budget's 24% of GDP, so that gives you a sense of magnitude. So there's not much left. And of course, if you look at what that means, that's everything from NASA to housing assistance to transportation, the air traffic control, on and on and on. These are things that absolutely we need to have to function.
Now, do tax cuts affect the balancing of the budget?
Yes, they do.
And if you have massive tax cuts that aren't paid for, that'll increase the deficit?
Yeah, I think the general principle here, at very least going forward, is that any new fiscal policy proposal, whether on the tax side or on the spending side, has to be paid for. That, CBO scored, it has to be paid for. That seems like the simplest thing that we can do here so that we don't make things worse compared to the base that.
Are you aware that there was pay-go under Democratic control of Congress and under Republican control of Congress? Tax cuts don't have to be paid for?
Yeah, I think it should apply to both, the spending side and the tax side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Josh Burkeen of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I greatly appreciated you talking about the $120 trillion total debt liability that I think the Heritage Institute, or not Heritage Institute, Heartland Institute, I think is the only one actually last year wrote about it, which maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody at this table that wrote about it last year. If you did, I apologize. But it went without notice. And I think if I remember the Heartland Institute, the way they assessed that $120 trillion total debt liability, $31 trillion plus the Medicare and Social Security, veterans, federal employee pensions, different trust programs. They said it's 86% of all wealth. If you assessed it against all valuation of all assets in America, it's 86% of all wealth in America, down to pieces of furniture. Biden administration's commentary for the Treasury Department was down to pieces of furniture. So we're in a real mess. I want to be specific because we've got limited time. I want to talk about work requirements, something that's kind of coming up in this discussion, and I hope that the president will come to the table. I know that Speaker McCarthy is saying we need to have a negotiation, something that President Clinton and Gingrich did, is they had conversations and were able to come up with solutions in divided government that included work requirements. So I want to focus on work requirements. 55% of able-bodied adults enrolled in Medicaid through Obamacare's Medicaid do not work at all. 64% of able-bodied adults on food stamps do not work at all. Even before COVID-19 pandemic and the related policy changes, which increased benefits and decreased rules around work, 48.5 million of able-bodied adults who received Medicaid, food stamps, public housing, child care benefits, only 3 million of that 48.5 million were subject to work requirements. Before COVID-19, a majority of able-bodied adults on Medicaid did not work at all. They reported zero earned income. Before COVID-19, 3 out of 4 able-bodied adults on food stamps did not work at all. So there's a maximum from 1935, and I put it to memory because I think it's powerful. Something that I think we can all agree on, maybe put our partisan hats aside. It says, you cannot help the poor man by destroying the rich man. You cannot strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. You can't lift the wage earner up by pulling the wage payer down. You can't build character and courage by taking away people's initiative and independence. And you can't help people permanently by doing for them what they could and should be doing for themselves. And you can't further the brotherhood of man by inciting class hatred. Mr. Walker, starting with you. What are your thoughts on work requirements? There's a CBO estimate out there that says that it could save as much as $300 billion while increasing revenue by another $221 billion. And couldn't this solve some of our worker shortage issues versus always looking to illegal immigration in addition to affecting our budget? And couldn't it change a lack of work ethic that's undermining this nation?
Several things. We ought to have work requirements. There's no question about it, at least looking for work, attempting to look for work. Secondly, it tells you that some of our programs are obviously pretty generous because people don't have to work, and they may not even be looking for work, if you will. But you also have to look at the difference between what does our economy need with regard to skills and knowledge, versus what we have. And the biggest problem that we have is that we have a skills gap. We have a knowledge and skills gap, and our immigration policy really needs to be focused on that. By the way, most of our European allies have already figured this out. It shouldn't be focused just on relationship. It needs to be focused on what type of skills and knowledge do we need in this country in order to grow the economy, to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. And by the way, last thing on this, and it's related but not direct. Not everybody's going to go to college, all right? Not all college degrees are equal. Not all colleges are equal. We need a lot of people in the trades. Let's learn from Germany and some other countries to try to figure out how we can end up doing a better job there. Thank you.
Mr. Taylor?
Well, we need to invest more in people, for sure. That's what you seem to be saying. But I think that we can't lose sight of the big goals. I mean, 2% growth, this gigantic deficit. The gentleman from Utah, I don't know if you saw his chart, is astounding. Why can't we deal with that? You can deal with that.
Can I add something? Just reclaim
That's
my
the
time?
important thing to deal with.
So $1 trillion, it's a dated number, $1 trillion out of a $6 trillion budget, and this is dated, it's going to be larger than $1 trillion, is of the 82 federally means-tested program, which is direct cash, housing assistance, Medicaid, food. So this is a sizable number, and so couldn't we affect change in our budget?
Put it on the table. Put it on the table and discuss it with your colleagues. I would not be in favor of that. I would be in favor of things that induce growth, induce income for all Americans. And that's what my preference would be.
And Mr. Hodge, before I ask this, I want to say this, because I got 1 second left. Jamestown implemented a biblical requirement that finally made our colonies successful. Thou shalt not work, thou shalt not eat. Jamestown was the first successful colonization because they took something that is pretty common sense. Mr. Hodge, what are your comments on this?
The welfare reforms that were passed during the Clinton administration required work, and I think they were very successful. Sadly, they've been watered down since, And it leads to the kind of problems that you've just outlined in those numbers. The problem with our agencies today is they measure their success on how many people are on the rolls, not how many people they've helped off the rolls. And that's what we should be measuring, how many people we move from welfare to work to success and better living standards. And we've got all the incentives wrong.
I'm out of time. I yield.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma, and now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Wexton. Thank you for your patience from
Thank you very
Virginia.
much, Mr. Chairman. I was temporarily regretting my decision, but I think I made a good decision anyway. It's good to thank you all to the witnesses for coming and appearing before us today. It's been really, really informative, very fascinating stuff. Mr. Walker, I 100% agree with you. We need more people in the trades. Absolutely, we do. I mean, the world needs more electricians, the world needs more plumbers, and those folks do really well in their jobs. Try telling it to any of the parents in my district, though. But yeah, we definitely need more people in the trades. One thing that was interesting to me in your opening remarks, you talked some about China and how they are taking over global dominance. But you would agree that they have certain characteristics. The PRC actually has more certain characteristics which allow them to create a strategic long-term plans for global dominance. Do they not? Things like their reliance on use of forced labor enforced by brutally repressive surveillance state. Things like government ownership of means of production. Things like disregard for international law in areas of intellectual property and property generally. Is that true?
Yeah, we don't want to be like China,
No.
but we need a plan, because if you don't have a plan, all you have is prayer. I'm for prayer, but we need prayer to plan.
Right. No, I don't disagree that we need a plan. It's just hard to do that when you think in terms of when your budget cycles or for your presidential terms, and everybody's planning for the next one. We here in Congress, we have to start over again every 2 years. So it makes it kind of hard for us. But yeah, I absolutely agree we need a plan, and I don't know how we're going to get there, but I think it's a good thing to want to do and to work towards. Also, I'm fascinated by this discussion that you talked about when you and Alice Riverland went around the country and talked to people. Is that published somewhere where you have the results of that?
Yes, I can provide something for the committee if you want as well.
I would love to see what the results.
Yeah, that was the Comeback America initiative, and I'm happy to provide something for the committee.
Thank you. That would be good to see. Last week, the Joint Economic Committee released a report highlighting the potential effects of a debt default on American families. According to their findings, if Republicans push our country off over the cliff in a misguided attempt to cut discretionary spending by 20% or more, benefits for 65 million Americans on Social Security and 18 million American veterans could instantly be disrupted. The average worker could see their retirement savings drop by $20,000. In Virginia, a typical new homeowner would see their monthly mortgage payment increase by $150, costing them an extra $54,000 over the life of the loan. That would happen instantaneously. It doesn't even account for the long-term effects. Dr. Zandi, after all the economic shocks we've been through over the past few years, can American families afford a default? And are there other ways for a typical family might feel the effects of a default?
Well, their benefits would be delayed or ultimately cut. There would be loss of job and unemployment. People would see their stock holdings and housing wealth decline, so they'd be less wealthy. Their general everyone's financial well-being would be significantly diminished.
How about those students who are here? Would they feel it? Would they feel the effects of the default?
I suspect they would. I mean, their families would have a difficult time, I think, many of them making ends meet for sure. If it dragged on for any length of time. Again, hard to imagine once everyone sees exactly the implications of breaching the debt limit very quickly. I think people would reverse themselves and we'd increase the debt limit pretty quickly. But if it dragged on for any length of time, it would be, I don't think it's hyperbole to say it would be cataclysmic.
And the last time we really came to the brink was in 2011. Would you confirm
It was.
that statement? And in 2011, we did ultimately, or Congress did ultimately do the right thing and raise the limit, but it took a long time.
That was pretty scary.
It was pretty scary. And in fact, now Moody's did not downgrade the U.S. Creditworthiness, but Standard & Poor's did they not?
That's correct. They
That's
reduced
the first time ever in American history that happened, right?
Correct.
Now, do you think that the investment community is too confident that in the situation that we're going to do the right thing and come together before August?
I worry that they are too confident. I suspect that we'll come back after July 4th break, and people will start to focus on that X date, which is, in my view, mid-August, and pressures will start to intensify pretty quickly, depending on the dynamics here in the House, particularly with regard to how things are going. But I think it will be very important for investors to send a signal to lawmakers that, hey, this is not a good idea. This is going to be a real problem, because unless you get that signal, you may not act.
Well, one thing we have going for us, Dr. Zandi, is that there is in August is usually our recess time, and I'm sure a lot of people have CODELs planned. So hopefully they won't want to miss out on their CODELs, and they want to come to a solution way before August 1st. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Virginia, and now yield 5 minutes to Chuck Edwards from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I think that hearing some of the myths from the other side of the aisle, I think the American people need to deserve to hear a few pieces of the truth. First of all, the Republicans have not yet put forth a budget. Number one, because the president drug his feet on getting us a budget, and that begins the process. And I really have a tough time believing that he would be so delayed in doing that, knowing the critical nature of the decisions that we've got to make here in just a few months. Another reason that I see that we've not put forth a budget is the Republicans are being very deliberate in bringing professionals like this in to testify and give us some thoughts that we should consider as we're developing that budget. Another reason that you've not seen a budget from the Republicans is because Speaker McCarthy has desperately been trying to get a meeting with President Biden to discuss the debt ceiling being raised and under what conditions that would happen. And to my knowledge, the president has refused to have such a meeting. Another set of myths that I continue to hear from the other side is that Republicans are wanting to cut Social Security and Medicare. And I have not had any conversation with any member of this committee that believes that that's the right thing to do. And quite frankly, I'm just tired of hearing that political point. So now I'll move on. I'm off of my rant, and I'd like to ask a couple of questions. Mr. Hodges, can you discuss the economic effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
On the whole, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was pro-growth, especially, and there were two really important elements to it. One, it was pro-growth, and two, especially the corporate tax reforms made the United States much more competitive. Before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the United States had the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. We are now at least modestly competitive, and we are down now into the middle of where our economic competitors are. To raise that corporate tax rate would have severe economic effects. Our model shows that the Biden budget, by increasing the corporate rate, would knock about 0.7% off the long-term effects of the GDP, and it would cause both a reduction in wages but also jobs. So we do not want to raise the corporate tax rate. We don't want to put ourselves in being the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. So there are a lot of positives with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There are some things I would not have done, like raising the child tax credit, but those are just political decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Hodges. For Americans out there that don't deal in budgets from day to day, and for students like we had in here earlier, can you illustrate to folks in practical terms why raising the corporate tax rate causes or loses us jobs in the U.S.?
Yeah, there are a lot of studies that have been done looking at the effects of the corporate tax rate on wages. And a very important study done a few years ago looked and found that increasing the corporate tax rate, the economic effects of that on workers was about 50%, meaning that raising the corporate tax rate lowered wages for workers. And the most harmed workers were marginal workers, women, low-skilled workers, and younger workers were most impacted by that. And I think we need to take that to heart as we look at trying to raise revenues to lower the deficit.
Not to mention that companies typically like to do business offshore when
tax rates are better over there rather than having jobs
When
here.
other countries are more competitive, that's where the capital flows.
Yeah, thank you. What is your analysis of the tax increases in the president's budget proposal?
Yeah, we found it to be very harmful. Our model shows that the president's budget would lower GDP by at least 1.3% over the next decade, would lower wages, the capital stock, and ultimately eliminate about 335,000 jobs. And I should mention that we didn't even model all of the president's budget proposals. Some of them are too new and untested to be modeled. So we think the economic damage would be much more severe than what we've modeled.
Thank you. I'm out of time, so I yield.
I thank the gentleman and now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Vermont, Ms. Belen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Zandi and the rest of the panel, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time. The Biden administration has consistently prioritized health and well-being of Americans. It has prioritized preventing homelessness, supporting first-time homeowners, and ensuring that Americans can keep their homes and keep their homes heated. And some of my Republican colleagues have suggested that eliminating or reducing some programs, such as the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, would be beneficial to the budget. This program helps 5 million Americans. They've also suggested that ending critical rental assistance for 10 million Americans is the way to go. As a former teacher and as a parent myself, I know that that safe and stable housing is essential for a child's mental and physical health, and it's critical for a student's ability to succeed. So, Dr. Zandi, what are some of the economic consequences and personal consequences of ending or reducing programs that keeps families in their homes?
Well, this goes to the discretionary non-defense spending part of the budget, that 3% of GDP. And in that are many of the different things you just mentioned around homelessness and housing assistance. And I think LIHEAP is probably in there as well.
Yes.
And, and it's important to point out that as a share of GDP, these spending on these programs have been declining pretty consistently over recent decades, and now are at record lows as a share of GDP. So we have been, collectively deciding to reduce the priority that we place on these different types of programs. But I think it's pretty clear that the households that are being affected, the people that are being affected by this, are financially very stressed. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have any savings. And they're the folks that are now borrowing against their credit cards and unsecured personal lines. You can see delinquency rates on cards and unsecured personal lines, auto loans, particularly used vehicles, are now well above where they were pre-pandemic. And this is at a time when the unemployment rate is at a 50-year low. Can you imagine, if there's any kind of unemployment? So that kind of gives you the level of stress that exists, among that group. And of course, you'd be putting, additional pressure, financial pressure, and it's just unclear how that would play out. And the implications of that are enormous, obviously for those households, but for the communities that they live in, what it means for the broader economy can't be good. Can't be good.
Thank you, Dr. Zandi. I'm hearing that same thing from the credit unions back in my home state of Vermont. They're starting to see delinquency rates on payments that they haven't seen in recent years, and this is a foreboding development. So, the other thing that I want to say here is that our country seems to be headed for a debt crisis. And as my colleague said earlier, this is not the first time that we face this dangerous brinksmanship, and it's wholly disingenuous. That's the point that I want to make here. It is wholly disingenuous. They had no concerns about raising the debt ceiling under previous Republican presidents, including multiple times under President Trump. And so you have to question, why are we here again, having this same sham conversation when my colleagues knew what was at stake when President Trump was in office and raised the debt ceiling? So, Mr. Zandi, how would defaulting on our debt impact Americans, like my Vermonters back home who own a home, want to keep their home, or people who want to aspire to own a home?
Yeah, I think I've mentioned that it's hard to imagine that we would go down that path because the consequences, the immediate consequences would be very serious. You'd see it immediately in financial markets, obviously. You'd see it immediately in that people won't be getting paid on time, the things that the benefits that they're owed, or even the electric company's not going to get their payment on time, potentially. And then, longer it drags on, if it goes from hours to days to weeks, then we will start to see lots of lost jobs, unemployment would rise, we would be in a very severe economic downturn. But, that's the most obvious thing. I think longer run, the damage it would do would be incalculable. I mean, since Alexander Hamilton assumed the debt, the world knows that Americans pay their debts. We are money good. And because we're money good, we pay the lowest interest rates in the world. And most importantly, in times of crisis, money comes here because everyone knows it's safe. No one's going to take that away from you. You're going to get paid on time. If we dissuade them of that notion and lose that hard-fought benefit that we've accumulated over the course of our entire history, it would be incalculable to the cost to the folks, the young people that are here just an hour ago. So it's not only the immediate effects, it's the longer-term consequences of doing that. So it's just unimaginable we would even be thinking about this. And it just goes to the counterproductive nature of this piece of legislation.
Yes.
I think that.
Thank you, Dr. Zandi. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and yield 5 minutes now to Mr. Buddy Carter from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here, and we appreciate everything you've got to say. I think that we would all agree that the general theme here today is that we're in dire straits. We're in dire straits, and it just does not seem like we have a concrete plan to address where we're going. My hope is that this committee will assist with that, and I'm committed to doing everything I can to assist us in doing just that and helping us to be successful. But I certainly don't feel like the president's proposed budget does it. I don't see a concrete plan there. It continues to be an addiction to spending. I mean, you've talked about numerous times today about how much this proposed budget is going to be spending over the next decade. Unbelievable. Dr. Taylor, you even pointed out in your testimony that the Biden administration doesn't anticipate a growth rate of any more than 2.2% over the next 10 years. I mean, that's the only thing that's really gotten us any kind of relief at all, is that we've been prosperous and we've been able to grow our economy. If this is true, that we only grow it at 2.2%, and we have all this interest that we are going to have to pay on this debt, we are really in a mess. I think the biggest indication of just how much of a mess we're in is the interest on our debt. I mean, it's unimaginable. You talk about unimaginable for us not to pay our debt, and we're going to pay our debt. We know that. We're not going to default on anything. But the only thing more unimaginable than that is that $32 trillion in debt and the interest on that debt, that we're going to be paying more on the interest on our debt than we're going to be paying for defense. The number one responsibility of this federal government is to protect our homeland and protect our country. And we're going to be paying more on the interest on the debt. Dr. Taylor, let me ask you, what do we get from interest spending? What do we get when we pay the interest? Do we derive anything from it?
It just reminds us of the debt we've already incurred, and so that's the issue.
And we're not even talking about the principal. We're just talking about the interest. That makes it even worse. Does it make any sense to be on track to have interest be the largest federal program? And it is predicted, I think y'all have even mentioned, that it's going to be the largest line item in our budget. Does that make any sense, Dr. Taylor?
No, it does make sense. That's why I say look at the whole picture of the budget. Get it down. Get it to, I say balance, whatever you want to, get it down. And we've seen so many illustrations of that already in this hearing that we need to, you need to drill down, and your colleagues need to drill down. You need to get a hold of it.
Let me ask you, and I'll ask any of you, what's it gonna take to get people's attention? What's it gonna take to get people's attention? Members of Congress, what's it gonna take to get our attention? And I'll include myself in that, to recognize just how serious of a problem this is. Mr. Walker?
We have three maladies in America: myopia, tunnel vision, and self-interest. People are very short-term focused. They look at one issue at a time without understanding the big picture, the domino effect, and they're concerned about themselves, okay? That's just not typical Americans. That's here, too. What's going to get your attention here is a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment that says you cannot take on more than a certain amount of debt as a percentage of the economy. That will force pro-growth policies, but it'll force tough decisions with regard to spending, mandatory and discretionary, as well as revenues. That's what you need. And if you don't get that, I'm not very hopeful about our future.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, the sad fact is, Congressman, that our federal budget is what we call in economics a tragedy of the commons. Every member of this body is responsible for spending the money, and no one is accountable for how it's spent or how poorly it's spent. And until we can change some of those dynamics, we're going to continue to have these problems. Somebody is going to have to take responsibility, and it has to begin now.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I appreciate that. And, you know, I know somebody made the comment a minute ago that we got a revenue problem. No, we don't have a revenue problem. We got a spending problem. I'm sorry, did you want to speak?
No, I was just, count me naive, but I'm hopeful. I think the last time we collectively made a lot of progress on our long-term fiscal situation was in the 90s. And that's the last time interest expense rose to a point where it was greater than the amount we spent on defense and other things that we all can agree that are very important. And we're going to be there here pretty soon. So my sense is that over the next couple, 3-4 years, you will get a consensus that we do need to change that.
Well, let's hope we have the political courage to do just that and the political sense. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
thank the
yield back.
gentleman from Georgia, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here with us and for your patience today. In my district, a lot of retirees' hard-earned dollars are at risk, and many of them are worried about what might happen with some of the conversations around raising the retirement age. In France, we're seeing the consequences of raising the retirement age against the interest and will of workers. I hope Congress is taking notice of that. It is not trivial to propose raising the age to retire when many working class people are living paycheck to paycheck with exhausting jobs. And we have better ways to address solvency and fiscal issues with important programs like Social Security and Medicare. Dr. Zandi, can you outline proposals that would make our social safety net more sustainable and effective, which shouldn't require workers to pick up the tab?
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit about this with Congressman Kildee. I think a way to put Social Security on sound financial ground or sounder financial ground is to impose the payroll tax on folks that make over $400,000 a year. Right now, there's a cap. I think last year was $164,000. It goes up this year. I can't remember what the number is. But if you impose it on the folks that make over $400K, that would generate a significant amount of revenue that would go a long way to putting Social Security on very solid ground. And all we would be doing is ultimately raising the percentage of earnings that are affected by the payroll tax back to where it was when Social Security was first established back in the 1930s. So, and the reason we've gotten into this kind of situation, many reasons, but one is the ongoing skewing of the income and wealth distribution, and this would go a long way to addressing, that issue. So I think that would be a good way of, in the case of Social Security. Medicare and Medicaid are more difficult because it goes to the cost of medical care, and that's, as we all know, a very complex issue. And we talked a little bit about prescription drug negotiations as an example of something that we could work on to make that a way of restraining the growth in medical care expenditures, not cutting benefits, but making them more affordable. So those are two examples.
I appreciate that. It's good to know that there are options that don't require Americans to work longer. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record a report released this week from the Center for American Progress on the fiscal and socioeconomic costs of tax cuts.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Without the Bush and Trump tax cuts, debt as a percentage of the economy would be declining permanently. Over the past 25 years, tax cuts enacted initially during the Republican trifecta severely slashed federal revenues. It is estimated that these tax cuts have added $10 trillion to the debt since their enactment. Dr. Zandi, could you explain why making the Trump tax cuts permanent would harm our fiscal and economic outlook?
It would be very costly. In fact, in the baseline budget, the budget that we've all been alluding to here, that the CBO scores, assumes that the tax cuts will expire as they are currently legislated under law. So if they're made permanent, then that baseline budget would show much worse fiscal outlook than we're talking about here, and to a significant degree. And you make a great point. The last time, I think the good benchmark here is in the year 2000, fiscal year 2000, we had a surplus. That was the last year we had a surplus. And you're right, there's many reasons for that, some of which were fortuitous, but some of which were the result of good policymaking in the 1990s and during the Clinton administration. And a number of things have conspired to erode our fiscal situation. The tax cuts under President Bush, the tax cuts under President Trump contributed, and the spending that will also increase significantly because of a number of crises, the financial crises, very significant increase, the pandemic, a massive increase, and also the conflicts overseas, the wars that we've been fighting in the Middle East. So you add all that up, that's now put us into the position that we're in today with a debt to GDP, publicly traded debt to GDP that's close to 100%. So it's a combination of things that have gotten us into this predicament.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. It is obviously clear with that these tax cuts shouldn't even be on the table if we're trying to be serious about our fiscal responsibility. It's one thing for our Republican colleagues to say they want to be fiscally responsible, and it's another for them to continue to push for tax cuts for the rich and corporations. This kind of hypocrisy really puts the health of our economy at risk. And I hope that we become sensible in addressing the fiscal health of our country. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady from Minnesota and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Benklein from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was worried that I was going to come in too late to join the conversation, but I think I'm coming in at just the right time because I need to correct the record. And the record should reflect that this country has record revenues this year. We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. And when we cut taxes, the only way that those tax cuts would contribute to the deficit or the debt is if they are not matched by spending cuts. It's the other side of the aisle that decided they were not going to match those tax cuts with spending cuts because this side of the aisle would be happy to make the spending cuts that are necessary to keep this budget in balance. We were in balance once. It does require growth. More growth comes from lower taxes. Less growth comes from higher taxes. So allowing the tax cuts to expire will have a negative impact on growth, will have a negative impact on revenues, and will have a negative impact on this economy unless we take necessary action to cut non-defense discretionary spending, get rid of all the woke and weaponized government that has created such chaos across this country, and actually begin to exert some signs of fiscal responsibility that are so woefully lacking across this government. The world is watching. We are at risk of losing the dollar as our global reserve currency. We are, and you want to see a recession? Take that away. Replace that with currency from some other country. And you'll see inflation like you've never seen. You'll see deficits like you've never seen. You'll see a recession like you've never seen. But what I want to get focused on is What I want to ask Dr. Taylor, just as government spending crowds out private investment, the reckless spending habits here in Washington is crowding out our own capacity to spend, as more dollars must be committed to paying off interest. This issue of interest on the debt and the fact that it is crowding out spending, can you talk about the economic harm resulting from such a large increase to interest payments on the debt?
Yes, this is really one of the reasons to deal with this debt problem, because there's interest on the debt. But all evidence says that restraining the growth of government to modest levels, much different than what's in this current budget, would be beneficial to growth, beneficial to all Americans. We'd have rather than less than 2%, we have 2% plus. And that is so powerful. That's the thing that should be, I don't hear enough about that. That should be emphasized more. These are growth-inducing policies. The tax cuts, if you like, or at least leaving the tax rate where they are, would be growth-inducing. And it's just part of the picture. I mentioned monetary policy, that's also part of it. So I think it's very important to emphasize these things.
Well, let's talk about MMT and those that insist upon ignoring realities and adding to this reckless spending. Can you talk about the fantasy world in which these MMT theorists live?
It's a good description. It's hard to make, we look at it carefully as we can, and I think that you can't say much about it. It's just another way to think about. The reality is the government thrives because of good economic policy. Good economic policy is good fiscal policy, good monetary policy, good regulatory policy, good international policy. They all go together. We focus on the budget because this is the budget committee, but it all goes together. And you heard people say about that, talk about that already. I emphasize that when I teach students. That's what I do. I emphasize this all goes together.
Mr. Hodge, President Biden's proposed raising the corporate tax rate to 28%, larger than China. Do you think that raising the corporate tax burden above communist China would make us less competitive against our top foreign adversary?
It would actually be worse than raising above the Chinese level. It would actually put the U.S. Tax rate back to one of the highest corporate tax rates in the industrialized world. And we know from economics, economists at the OECD have found that the corporate income tax is the most harmful tax for economic growth. And economic studies also show that the economic burden of the corporate tax largely falls on workers through lower wages. This would be a very, very harmful policy impact on the U.S. economy.
Thank you. I appreciate the time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Trone from Maryland.
Thank you, Chairman, and I apologize being late. I missed most of the testimony. We had 2 appropriations subcommittee hearings, but that's over with and we're here. Mr. Zandi, I'm with Dr. Zandi, address these things to you since you went to the same school I went to. You got 2 degrees. I only got 1. I got an MBA at Wharton, and I serve as a trustee there at the Wharton School of Business also. I probably created more jobs than anybody on the committee. I've created over 12,000 employees I have, and I have a $6 billion business that I own. So I understand a little bit about taxes, just a little bit, and it's an honor to pay taxes in America. The individual tax rate graduate up to 39.6, fantastic. We ought to pay taxes, and we have a lot of good things that happen with our taxes, and we're fortunate we live here. I take exception that we have a point that we do have a revenue problem. We blew a hole in the revenue problem when we dropped that corporate rate from 35 down to 21. Because you don't just pay a rate, you pay an effective rate. And so we should talk about the effective rate. Otherwise, it's all political rhetoric, talking about a rate that nobody pays. That's just BS in my mind. So the effective rate before the Trump tax cut, which was 24% for the U.S. effective rate, the G7 rate was 23%. I find that competitive. And guess what? In my years of building a business, I never once on an investment decision said, what's the tax rate before I make an investment? What I said was, what's the competitive milieu out there, and how do I beat my competitor? And then how I create a P&L statement that works for me at the end of the day. And that seemed to have worked over the years. But nobody is asking, what's the tax rate to create a job? That's coming from members that have only served their life in state legislators or been lawyers all their life, and they've never paid a payroll on Friday for 40 years. So my point was, if we were at 24% before effective on a 35% top, and the G7 was 23, we were competitive. What now is the effective rate for C corporations?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. 15%. Is it 15? Yeah, 15%.
15.
15%.
I think it's lower than that. I believe he's wrong on that point, but we can follow up on that and get back, and I'd appreciate that.
Sure, yeah.
The second issue we've got problems on is the Trump budget in the third year was roughly $980 billion deficit. Last year, the Obama budget was about $470 billion, round numbers. Well, that delta, that was the biggest increase ever in our deficit, other than war, et cetera, from Obama final year to Trump year 3 pre-COVID. That was a hole blown in the budget of $200 billion every year, a revenue problem, which the Wharton Econometrics study and everybody else estimates at $2 trillion over 10 years, a $200 billion revenue problem every single year, giving C corporations and all their lobbyists and all their cronies a nice, wonderful tax break. And we pretend, well, they might go overseas, God knows, but these guys never run a business, so it's all just a lot of blather, a lot of campaign talk. So at the end of the day, what do we need to do to try and bring some sanity back to this? And what issues, what should we change and affect, like carried interest loophole, like a step-up basis? Elon Musk paid 8% last year. Because all he does is borrow off his stock holdings, live a life of a huge billionaire, and doesn't have any earnings. Nobody takes payroll tax. That's tax inefficient. No one would do that. LLCs are paying the personal rate now. So all your small businesses that are creating all the economic growth in America, they're paying the personal rate, top rate 39.6. But the C Corps, they're paying, I believe, close to single digits. So what are some of the things we should do to bring us back sanity and get the rates up? Because business will do fine. Let's not worry about business doing fine. They're going to figure it out. I've figured it out for 40 years.
Well, I hope your colleagues don't hold the Wharton degree against you. Yeah. And I'm also not just an egghead. I started my own company and sold it to Moody's. And I can tell you, as a person who created not 12,000 jobs, congratulations on that, but a few hundred jobs, that I never asked the question about the tax rate. You know what, the thing I asked was, the thing that was key to me was, just tell me what the tax rate is, keep it there, and let's just go forward. Because I can navigate around anything. I just need to know what the rules of the game are. But in the case of, and here I think, where we should find common ground, it's really critical that we figure out exactly what was the impact of the TCJA cuts on the economy. There's you can tell a lot of debate, but the academic research I've seen seems to suggest that the impacts are really on the margin, that they have not had much of an impact. Therefore, rolling back the tax rates halfway, they were 35, they went to 21, let's say go back to 28 like President Biden has proposed, would have on the margin kind of negative economic consequences, generate a boatload of revenue that we need to address our fiscal issues going forward as the population continues to age. But I agree with you. As a researcher looking at the consequences of corporate taxes on investment spending, expansion, and hiring, those kinds of things, very difficult. The cost of capital isn't what really matters. It's can I sell what I produce, and just give me the rules, and I'll win. I just need to know what the rules are.
Thank the gentleman, Mr. Trone, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from Kansas, Ron Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be here. Thank you for all the panelists for being here. I know members have been in and out for different things. I do want to make a comment about, the last several of us have talked about tax rates and talked about revenue versus spending. One of the statistics, maybe even I think is more important than rates itself, is what are the actual tax revenues that the federal government collects. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is our scorecard, when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017, CBO estimated that in 2022, we would collect $4.0 trillion in tax revenue. Now that 2022's passed, even after working through COVID, we actually raised $4.9 trillion. So we actually received over $900 billion in tax revenue after Tax Cuts and Jobs Act because of people being able to have that economic growth and activity there. So that's one of the things I just wanted to highlight as far as tax revenue and the net impact of good economic policies. Jumping back into, I know I don't have much time here, the fiscal state of the union. I was a little concerned about some of the comments earlier. Let's see, I heard from the panelists that the fiscal state of the union is not good, that it's embarrassing, that continuing increasing debt to GDP drives up the actual interest rate that the federal government has to pay for borrowing, which tells me that we need to make sure that we stop borrowing as much through that process. So I looked at some statistics. Our federal government borrows $1 out of every $5 it spends this year. 1 out of every 5. And President Biden's budget proposed to increase that next year to borrow 1 out of every $4 that's being spent. It adds $17 trillion to the national debt. Never before has a U.S. president proposed to add $17 trillion to the deficit in 10 years. And they say, they try to talk that it's actually a $3 trillion cut in the deficit because they're not raising it $20 trillion. So that just doesn't make sense from where we are today to where we need to be going into the future. Also, the spending programs have had massive negative impact on families and businesses. Inflation's up 14% on average. Things that are critical on a day-to-day basis, like food's up 20%, energy's up 37% for gas and heating our home. I want to talk through, I've got a couple questions here I hope I can get to about all of those. Is one of the challenges year after year, spending outpaces our revenue. It's unsustainable. It's unsustainable in our personal lives, unsustainable in business, unsustainable for state and local governments. Yet the borrowing that we do is $47,000 a second in terms of the federal government borrowing. So, which obviously, as I mentioned before, had an impact on interest, crowds out capital in funding other programs as well as funding the economy. Professor Taylor, our current net interest spending is about 8% of federal government budget. It's expected to go to 14% by 2033 and 24% by 2053. Do you agree with assessment, and what challenges do you foresee in the next 10 years when about 1/6 of our budget is on interest alone?
Well, these numbers are very concerning. That's why I emphasize so much to get the budget deficit down so we don't accumulate so much debt. And the question for you is, how fast do we do that? How do you convince your colleagues one way or the other? Personally, I think the faster the better, because it's so large at this point. And that will deal with the problem you're indicating. The exact amount are hard to calculate, but it'll deal with the problem you're indicating, and that's what we should do.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Walker, my colleagues, particularly on the other side of the aisle, have indicated that there's no real correlation between some of the massive amounts of spending and the interest rates being near 40-year highs. Can you help us walk through how those are related?
Economics 101. Too much spending has resulted in additional deficits. Additional deficits increases debt to GDP, slows economic growth. That has been facilitated in part by the Fed, which had very loose money policy with regard to interest rates and also bought a lot of our Treasury securities. That resulted in excess inflation. That resulted in the need to increase interest rates. That resulted in some of the things that frankly led to the fall of these two banks recently and uncertainty in the banking sector. It's all interconnected, okay? And by the way, the two major things are too much spending and the 180-degree reversal on energy policy. We were energy independent. That's not just with regard to energy prices. It's with regard to agricultural. Fertilizer is relied on that. So those two things, get control of spending and get back to energy independence are the two important things. You are going to have more revenues as a percentage of GDP. The math doesn't work without it. The question is, how do you get there? Pro-growth policies, how do you do tax reform where you can generate more revenue as a percentage of GDP? Spending is the primary problem, overwhelmingly, but it's not the only problem.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Kansas, and now yield 5 minutes to my fellow Texan, Mr. Chip Roy.
Thank the chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here today. I know there's been a lot of back and forth about revenue side, differences of opinion about corporate tax rate, 15%, 20x% higher, how that compares to pass-through rates, subchapter S. Fine. Why don't we just concede and stipulate that we could continue to work to improve the tax code, to adjust those rates one way or the other? We could have that debate. But at the end of the day, true or false was the, and I would ask this question, I don't know, maybe Mr. Taylor or Mr. Hodge. This last year was our overall tax revenue brought into the Treasury as a percentage of GDP at a relative historic high, at 19.6%, close to 20%. Are we not talking about a relative historic high for our nation in terms of revenues as a percentage of economic output? Right. So what we're talking about here when we hear a question, and Mr. Walker, you just speculated, and I agree with what you're saying on energy and other issues, saying, well, we're going to have more revenue. And I think what I'm assuming and what you're saying is we got to have more revenue if we're going to continue to spend at the levels we're spending, and that you're arguing that we're going to have to spend at those levels because of mandatory spending that we owe, and that we continue to grow discretionary spending, whatever that might be. So therefore, you're going to need more revenue if you want to make that math work. But I think it's really important for the American people to understand, and I just want to double down on this, that for the record, for the American people to understand, we're at 19.6%, almost 20% of relative amount of inflow revenue to the Treasury as a percentage of GDP, and we have, for the most part, give or take a few decimal points, never been higher than that. Post-World War II, at the beginning of our country now. True or false? I just want to make sure we're agreement on that.
One time, 2000 was the peak. We were over 20% of GDP.
But
That's
just
when we had a
slightly,
surplus.
correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Say that again? Mr. Taylor, I'm sorry, Mr.
That was an accident in 2000 because of it was the internet bubble, drove up capital gains rates and so forth. So
Right.
it was pure accident.
Right. So to the point, though, being at the relative level, 20%, with that and agreed that there was a spike there at the end of the dot-com boom in the 90s where that all kind of collided, and we were able to get to a point there where we obviously had zero deficit, right? The reason that is so critical is because everything we're talking about here, we're talking about revenue side, we have got to maintain economic growth, right? You guys have talked about that. Nothing we're talking about here, zero, will do anything relative to economic growth. Would you all agree that in order to solve our debt crisis at the moment, and we have a debt crisis, that economic growth is certainly the key driver to our ability to get out of it, sort of post-World War II example? Go ahead, Mr. Walker.
We ought to focus on debt to GDP. That's what matters, not balanced budgets, debt to GDP. So you grow the denominator faster than the numerator, okay? And by the way, that was the #1 principle that a supermajority, over 90% of registered voters agreed to.
But if I can get to the point, though, on economic growth, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Hodge, do you agree economic growth is the key driver for our ability to get out of the debt crisis we're in now?
Absolutely. That's in my written testimony, oral testimony. It's so important.
In order to achieve economic growth, is it better or worse to have a larger federal bureaucracy?
Oh, goodness, no. Right now, we have a government that's draining the private sector of productive capital, and it's dragging down the U.S. economy. And until we reverse that, we are not going to have the growth that we really deserve and really need to get out of this debt crisis.
So as we look ahead and recognize the need to deal with mandatory spending, and I invite any one of my Democrat colleagues to sit down at a table and address mandatory spending rather than just giving speeches about it and giving commercials about it, but put that as a conversation that needs to be dealt with on a bipartisan basis. True or false, if we're going to address what we need to do to get economic growth and deal with spending in order to combat inflation, would it make sense for us to currently go back and restrain Leviathan and go reduce the size and scope of the overall federal bureaucracy and discretionary spending right now, and go take some of those dollars that have already been committed in some of the student loans, go take some of those dollars sitting over at Interior, EPA, and other places where they're using that as regulations to strangle economic growth and opportunity, constrain that in order to get the American people freed up? Would that do more to deal with inflation by constraining spending, put us on a path to save 3 or 4 trillion over 10 years, and then create economic growth by getting Leviathan out of the way? I would ask you all to give quick answers on that because my time's just about out.
Yes, and one of the things I suggested is end the emergency and all subsidies and spending associated with the emergency, including student loan.
Amen. Agreed. And I would ask just Mr. Taylor, Mr. Hodge to answer that real quick, and then I'll yield back.
No, I agree, you got it exactly right.
Yes, sir. I just returned from Europe, and the European countries are growing very slowly because of the size of their governments. And we're inching toward that level ourselves, and we're going to have the same economic outcome.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
I thank the gentleman from Texas and yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Ralph Norman from the Palmetto State.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for each of you. Sorry I had another meeting, so I hadn't heard all the discussion that's going on. Mr. Walker, we talked about the balanced budget amendment and how now it's more important than ever and has been agreed to with leadership. 10 years is what we pretty much agreed to. You've testified before Congress over 300 times. Can you kind of go over, walk me through how important this is and how important this is now?
Well, it's critically important that we do something to get our debt to GDP down to a reasonable level. I would respectfully suggest, Mr. Norman, that the right metric is not balanced budget, because balanced budget can also be gamed with, because it's a cash basis approach rather than accrual basis approach. And our huge increases in unfunded obligations are the real problem. So I think the only way you're going to get control of runaway spending and to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability is a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on. That's pro-growth. It says you got to deal with the numerator, but it didn't tell you how to deal with it. And Chairman Arrington has introduced HCR 24, which I respectfully request that you take a look at and potentially join.
Any others want to comment on that?
I don't want to wait for a balanced budget amendment to start the process of reducing the size of government and fixing the problems that are inherently there. If we wait, I mean, as much as a good idea a balanced budget may be, if we wait, then it will be too late.
Yeah, and that's in addition. I mean, we have over 504 amendments on specific cuts, including the woke dollars have been spent in the military to address the immediate spending for this year, for the 23-24 year. So we're out of runway as far as what you're talking about. And I agree 100% with you. That's just the spending trajectory that we've got to get down. And it starts today. And I think the public, everybody I understand, we complained about it. We blamed other people. Now's the time to actually do something with it. And it'll be a long sled with a constitutional amendment. But what we can do is take basically a non-Biden budget that's unacceptable to pretty much everybody, including his clean debt limit, which makes no sense at all, and trying to come up with a plan. Where we calculated the interest on the $32 trillion. For every $1 trillion is $30 billion. How is this accounted for? I know it's monetized, but how is this accounted for, in your opinion, in an upcoming budget?
So I want to address this question in the broader context. So your question is balanced budget. Why not aim for that? Doesn't have to occur overnight, doesn't have to, but that's a strategy that makes sense to people. On top of that, you have to realize we have these automatic stabilizers. So if we booms and slump, there's a change in the deficit as usually. So I would add that as well. But that's the way I would answer your questions.
And it's got to, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's got to be done now, but we've got to start the path toward that. And what I'm asking is, and y'all realize this, how hard it is up here. For every dollar spent, there's an advocate and there's a constituent that wants that dollar. That's the bind. But now, I think people are asking me, is not economic security national security? And it is. So we don't have the time. We don't have the luxury of blaming it on another administration. As bad as the Biden budget is, it's time, how are we going to fix it? And the only way I know to fix it is what we're doing. I know what Chairman Arrington and others and of us in the Freedom Caucus are doing is proposing things that the public doesn't agree with anyway once they see it. Anybody else have any comments on that? Mark, Mr. Walker?
Real quickly, I suggest three things in my testimony. There's a lot more detail. Absolute cut in the 2024 budget as compared to 2023. Secondly, create a mechanism, a statutory fiscal sustainability commission that will help engage the people and make recommendations to close the gap between spending and revenues over 10 years. And thirdly, a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on. That is absolutely critical. And by the way, Congress should have done it in 1979. There were 39 states that filed for applications for a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment, and Congress did not act. And this will go to the Supreme Court if Congress doesn't act. And it's a conservative Supreme Court.
Thank you. I yield.
I thank the gentleman. Let me make a comment because my name has been invoked in association with, and proudly so, in association with this constitutional amendment. Some people have encouraged me to stay neutral on everything. That's the problem. You stay neutral, we lose the country. You got to take a position. And I respect my colleagues for putting some of their thoughts on paper. I may totally disagree with them, but we've got to have this conversation. And I'm so heartened, quite frankly, with the constructive tone and conversation on substance. Obviously, some stark differences in the vision and path forward for our country. But I'm proud as the chairman of this committee that we're having this. I think this is the most important conversation, if not one of the most conversations that is going on in the people's capital. And it's been long overdue to focus on this. But what's more overdue, as my friend from Texas who beat George W. Bush for this seat, Kent R. Hance, he used to tell me, and he warned me before I got here, that after all is said and done in Washington, more is said than done. And we got to start getting to doing instead of just talking. But with respect to the constitutional amendment, I find it very intriguing. And for those who are curious about history relative to this issue, to know and to learn, I learned this from Mr. Walker, that states, there is a mechanism for states to say, the sovereign states, the free and sovereign states that form the United States, there is a mechanism for them to say, we have a problem with the way this republic is being governed. And if you don't change it, federal government representatives of the people, then we will intervene. And apparently they had enough people, states rather, petition for the opportunity to intervene. Most of those petitions were related to a fiscal responsibility amendment. I won't say a balanced budget amendment, some of them were, some of them weren't, but the majority were. They had the threshold. And the Constitution is very clear and expressly written such that Congress's job at that point is to tally that result and to convene a time and place for that convention. It didn't happen. And so you already had a threshold. Even if you haven't studied it, you want to go do your own homework on this, there's been a threshold at a level for our country that states have had to rattle their sabers and petition Congress to come together. And you know, last point here, and it is a point of personal privilege, and I'll try not to abuse that as the chairman, use a context that's relevant to a lot of conversations in the halls of Congress these days, climate change, and the policies that are being put forward to deal with them. I'll try to keep this very neutral and focused on the fiscal implications. Switzerland has some form of balanced budget amendment. When Switzerland took the Paris Climate Accord and the emission reductions for their country, and I would suggest their country and their governing body is more progressive when it comes to that issue. But they were forced to do what Mr. Zandi did, Dr. Zandi in his business, and what Dr. Trone had to do in his business, what local and state governments have to do, what almost virtually every organization has to do except for this institution. And that is they had to consider the cost of that particular set of programs to reduce emissions. So how did they do that? Well, they didn't cut, but they offered revenue raisers in the following: a surcharge on plane tickets and excise tax at the gas pump. And the people of Switzerland rejected it. Now, I find that refreshing. I find that a healthy democratic system. It's not healthy when you don't have to consider cutting somebody's favorite program. It's always somebody's favorite program, or hitting somebody in their pocketbook. That's the reality most people live in. And when you put a dose of that reality in, it changes people's behavior. And we don't have that context. When you borrow on the backs of future generations and you don't have the consideration I just mentioned, our behavior is irrational here. And the outcome has been disastrous. And again, we can debate how to best address it at this point, but I stand with the Honorable David Walker that there was an effort, and it was not enabled constitutionally by this body, and we need to recognize that. So thank you for that. Last person to testify, you guys have been tremendously patient. I appreciate it. Highest ranking member of the military veteran, distinguished service to our country, General Jack Bergman from the great state of Michigan. Wrap it up for us, General Jack.
I'm wrapping it up. I see in this august group that anything I would say as just a simple Marine would be, and I know that my colleagues sitting up here with me, they know that I have kind of a unique sense of humor. There is nothing funny about poor spending policy. There's nothing humorous about a governmental entity at whatever level that doesn't take itself serious in what its role is to provide the environment where others within the private sector, working together with the public sector, could do good things for the American people that they are honored to represent. So having said that, I got a couple of questions. Oh, by the way, I'm a Marine. I already mentioned that. I am not cheap. I am frugal. Because as the Marines, we know we're always going to be, for the most part, initially under-resourced. But we don't hesitate to go look for what we need when we need it. So, Mr. Hodge, President Biden has repeatedly promised that he would not increase tax burdens on those making less than $400,000. In fact, we heard last week one of his folks reiterating that's not going to happen. You know, but I don't necessarily see that in this budget. Do the proposals in his budget live up to that promise?
Well, there's a question of directly or indirectly, and perhaps directly they have avoided taxing directly people earning under $400,000, but people earning under $400,000 will be severely impacted by the collateral effects of these tax increases, whether it's increasing the corporate tax rate, increasing taxes on small businesses, et cetera. There will be an impact on those folks, and it will not be good. Our estimates are that at least 335,000 people will lose their job because of these tax increases. Most of those people earn under $400,000 a year. And so, yes, they will be impacted by it.
So, said a different way, just to make sure that, well, technically, if you make under $400,000 a year, your tax rate will not be affected.
Right.
But if you don't have a job, it really doesn't make any difference. Because if the taxes, as they're laid out, force a decrease in the number of those kinds of jobs that are available, you do, in effect, yeah, you're not paying any more taxes, but you're not able to pay your heating bills, you're not able to pay your, all the things that it takes to raise your family. Am I correct in that assessment?
Absolutely. Everyone's standard of living will decline as a result.
Okay. How would, along that same line, how would the proposed tax increases in the budget affect small businesses that already are faced with some really tough decisions of that small business owner as it relates to the rampant inflation, the broken supply chains, severe workforce shortages? And oh, by the way, before you answer that, I think the number that I heard was today, roughly 40% or less of those folks in the workforce were in the workforce in the late 70s under the Carter administration. Is that can you validate that that's a number that's been, but the fact, just look at the age. Look at the age of the workforce. You can tell if you're in the workforce today at age 40 years ago, you weren't in the workforce. You weren't even born. So the point is, almost half of our people in the workforce have no relative earlier experience in their life to compare what they're facing today. So getting back, affecting the small business.
Well, overall, the Biden budget is the largest attack on business, the largest tax increase on business perhaps in our history. Small business will be a big part of that with the increase in the various payroll taxes, the net investment tax, et cetera. It'll be a huge impact on small businesses across the board.
Okay. And there's a lot of, I'll just say, not exactly true information. True information can be just accidentally wrong, or it can be intended to be wrong, okay, to misinform. Could we close the budget deficits or pay for all of the progressives' spending proposals like Medicare for All is one example, by simply cutting defense spending or just taxing the rich? Could we close the budget deficits by doing that?
At some point, Congressman, you run out of other people's money. And there's simply not enough wealth in the United States to tax in order to close this gap.
And along the same line, and this is a subject that we've heard, take the cap off of earnings, which you pay Social Security into. If we took all the caps off of Social Security, would that then, extra revenue coming in through payments, would that solve the deficit problem?
I don't believe so, no.
No, because I remember, when Chairman Harrington and Congressman Estes and a couple of others came in on the Budget Committee 7 years ago now, I remember that was one of the first things that we were told. You could take all the caps off of the Social Security, and it's not even going to begin to be a dent in it. So I wanted to make sure we weren't living, by the way, I have a lot of acronyms in the military. You have acronyms for the acronyms in some cases. But this is a strong term. Some people could be offended by this. And I just take it for what it is. It's an acronym. And the acronym is LIAR, L-I-A-R. Living in altered reality. You're not a bad person, but you're not in the real world. And what we are trying to do here is put the government, the federal government, and the spending into the real world that our citizens and our folks who work can make the best out of a temporarily bad situation. With that, I just want to thank you for what you do every day. Thank you, Chairman, for the unprecedented level of information flow on our committee that's helping us as members to come to grips with some tough decisions. Thank you, sir.
You bet. Well, to the general and my friend, I've got to say, I'm very pleased with the conversation. I thought it was apropos that a group of students, General, before you got here, sat in this committee room to hear the conversation and to be made aware of what's at stake for their future with respect to the spending, the debt, our growing deficits, et cetera. I also think it's appropriate that somebody like yourself representing veterans throughout the country who who were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for our country. We're closing this because there are a lot of ways to solve problems here. Maybe 10 ways to skin every cat in this town. And we're not short on information. We're not short on, in some cases, solutions and alternative solutions. It's the political courage and the sacrifice to do it. And so I'll let you have the last word, General, but in summary, we have different views, in some cases wildly different views on how to address this. But one thing I heard from every witness, and I think pretty much from every member of this committee, is the fiscal state of the union is rapidly deteriorating, and that the path that we're on is just completely unsustainable. And I would just add, and this is my commentary, doing nothing is not just unacceptable, it's un-American. And I pray to God that our efforts here, thanks to the wisdom, insight, and perseverance as witnesses on this long hearing, we will execute on a plan that will give our children and our fellow Americans hope for the future. General Jack?
You know, Chairman, you just triggered something today. Today is March 29th. And a few years ago, much delayed, we established March 29th as the official, basically, welcome our Vietnam veterans back. I would just like to say, for the public record and to those who are listening, welcome home, brothers and sisters.
Amen. Amen. Nothing else to say there but to stand in support of our heroes. For the record here, Mr. Walker, Dr. Taylor, Mr. Hodge, Dr. Zandi, thank you so much again. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. With that, the committee is adjourned. Dr. Zandi, thank you.